Section 1. The show that forgot its own rules. There is a house on Spooner Street. It sits at number 31, a two-story colonial with yellow clapboard siding, a teal roof, and a bold red front door. From the outside, it is as ordinary as any house you have ever seen in a quiet New England suburb, a little mailbox at the end of the path, a modest front yard, a garage that sometimes appears and sometimes does not, depending entirely on whether the plot needs it that day. Inside, a family lives. A loud, chaotic, frequently ridiculous family who have been going about their business since the 31st of January 1999, when a man named Seth MacFarlane debuted his animated creation to the largest possible television audience, the people still sitting on their couches after Super Bowl 33. That debut pulled in around 22 million viewers. 22 million people sat with Peter, Lois, Meg, Chris, Stewie, and Brian on that first night, and enough of them stayed long enough for the show to survive 2 cancellations, a resurrection through cable reruns and DVD sales, and a run that has now extended across more than 25 years and well over 400 episodes. Family Guy has been on the air long enough that the children who watched it in secret when their parents went to sleep are now adults with children of their own who are probably watching it in secret when their own parents go to sleep. It is a show embedded in the culture so deeply that its characters, catchphrases, and rhythms feel like old furniture, familiar and comfortable, always there when you need them. And here is what makes that familiarity interesting and also deeply, wonderfully strange. For a show that has been running this long, for a show with this many episodes, this many writers, this many seasons of established story, Family Guy has some of the most cheerful, extraordinary, jaw-dropping disregard for its own internal logic of any program ever produced for American television. The rules that the show establishes in one episode evaporate by the next. Characters know things, then forget them. Characters die, then return. Backstories are told one way, then retold another way, and then retold a third way that contradicts both. The house at 31 Spooner Street reshapes itself room by room, floor by floor, depending on what the joke needs. Ages drift, jobs vanish, pregnancies last what a doctor would describe, with considerable alarm, as a physiologically impossible length of time. None of this is an accident exactly. The writers of Family Guy have always operated with what scholars of television call negative continuity, a term that essentially means the show hits a reset button between episodes, allowing characters to start fresh regardless of what happened before. It is a mode of storytelling that animated comedies lean on heavily, and Family Guy has leaned on it more heavily than most. The show wears its own inconsistencies with a kind of cheerful shrug, and over the years has even broken the fourth wall to acknowledge that continuity is not really high on its list of priorities. But acknowledging something and resolving it are two very different things, and there is a particular pleasure, one that is relaxing rather than frustrating, meditative rather than irritating, in sitting with these holes and turning them over quietly, one by one, like smooth stones found on a riverbank. The show has given us hundreds of hours of story. Within all of that story are threads that were dropped, facts that were stated and then unstated, physical laws that were briefly observed and then ignored for years. Each of these moments is a little window into the nature of how a long-running television show is actually made by dozens of writers working across many seasons, drawing from a vast and imperfect collective memory of everything that came before. So settle in, get comfortable. The lights are low, or they will be soon. Somewhere in the background, the quiet rhythm of this narration is going to carry you through the corridors of a house that cannot quite decide how many rooms it has, through the life of a man whose age is more of a suggestion than a fact, and through the stories of a dog, a baby, and a family who have been doing the impossible since before the turn of the century. This is about Family Guy. This is about what it forgot, what it changed, and what it simply could not keep track of. And by the time we are done, you will either be asleep or you will have a completely new appreciation for just how wonderfully strange a quarter century of television can get. Drop a comment letting us know where in the world you are watching from and what time it is where you are. And if this is the kind of content that helps you wind down, a subscription would mean a great deal. Section 2. The house that could not make up its mind. Let us begin with the building where almost all of this happens. The house at 31 Spooner Street, in the fictional town of Quahog, Rhode Island, is one of the most recognizable addresses in all of animated television. It has appeared in more than 400 episodes. It is the setting for kitchen arguments, living room disasters, basement revelations, attic hideaways, and thousands of scenes across a quarter-century of storytelling. You would think that by now, the people responsible for drawing it would have a fairly consistent picture of what is inside. You would be wrong. From the outside, the house is relatively stable. The yellow clapboard siding stays yellow. The red door stays red. The teal roof maintains its color. There is, most of the time, a garage attached to the right side of the structure, though the garage has a habit of disappearing in episodes where the exterior of the house is shown, but the garage would complicate the composition of the scene. There is a small porch, a mailbox, a front path, and a single tree in the yard. These elements are the anchor points, the things that tell you, yes, this is the Griffin house, this is Spooner Street, this is where the family lives. Step through the red front door and the reliability becomes somewhat more flexible. The ground floor has some constants. There is a living room to the left, almost always staged with a green sofa facing a television. There is a staircase somewhere behind the living room, though exactly where it sits relative to the front door, and the living room seems to shift by a few feet depending on what the camera angle requires. There is a kitchen to the right, recognizable by its orange cabinetry. There is a dining area. There is, in some episodes, a sunroom, or an enclosed porch that connects the main house to the backyard. This porch appears in a handful of stories and then stops appearing, not because it was removed, but simply because it was no longer needed, like a spare room in a real house that collects boxes and gets closed off. The upstairs is where things get genuinely interesting. The official bedroom count of the Griffin house, as established across the majority of the show's run, is 4. The master bedroom shared by Peter and Lois, a room for Chris, a room for Meg, and Stewie's nursery. There is also a bathroom. This is a fairly normal upstairs layout for a house of this size, and for the most part, these rooms appear where you would expect them to appear and contain what you would expect them to contain. But the show has also, over the years, revealed other spaces that emerge when the story requires them and vanish when it does not. There is the man cave, a space belonging to Peter that has at various points been located in the attic, in a room adjacent to the main bedroom, in a basement area, and in what appears to be a generically large space that is accessed through doors whose relationship to the rest of the house is never made entirely clear. This man cave contains a bar, a television, a pool table, and various other amenities appropriate for a middle-aged man attempting to escape his family. It is accessed through different means in different episodes. Sometimes there is a regular door, sometimes a trapdoor, sometimes a secret panel. The location and the access point shift according to the comedic requirements of each individual story. Then there are the rooms that appear for a single episode and are never seen again. Season 17, in the episode known to fans by its production title involving the commentating booth, revealed a room dedicated to home recording that nobody had ever mentioned before and that has not appeared since. This is a particularly illustrative example of what the writers and fans of the show have come to call the accordion house. The Griffin residence expands and contracts to accommodate whatever the current episode demands, behaving less like a fixed architectural structure and more like a storytelling device that happens to look like a house. The basement is another offender. The entrance to the basement has appeared in different locations on the ground floor across different seasons. Sometimes it is in the kitchen, sometimes it is off a hallway. Sometimes it opens from what appears to be a utility room that exists in that episode but not others. The basement itself has been the setting for Peter's various hobbies and schemes, and its size seems to depend less on the actual floor plan of the house and more on how much space the story needs. Fans who have attempted to map the Griffin house, and there are many of them, people who have paused episodes, studied angles, and drawn out careful floor plans have universally arrived at the same conclusion. There is no single, consistent floor plan. What exists instead is a collection of recurring spaces, each of which has a general location and a set of associated props and functions, but whose exact relationship to the other spaces is fluid. The living room is always roughly to the left of the entrance. The kitchen is always roughly to the right. The bedrooms are always upstairs. Beyond those rough coordinates, everything else moves. This is not necessarily a problem in the way that a structural flaw in an actual building would be a problem. Animated shows have always taken liberties with physical space. The Springfield of The Simpsons shifts its geography regularly. The town of Pawnee in Parks and Recreation has floor plans that do not survive contact with careful scrutiny. Any long-running show that uses the same buildings across hundreds of episodes will accumulate inconsistencies simply because dozens of different writers and directors interact with those spaces differently over time, and the visual medium of animation allows rooms to be drawn for each individual shot rather than being fixed physical locations. But there is something particular about the Griffin House's relationship with its own floor plan that goes beyond ordinary animated inconsistency. The house does not just vary in its geography, it actively adds and removes significant structural features based on what the plot needs at any given moment. This is not inconsistency so much as deliberate flexibility. The writers have said as much over the years, acknowledging that the house is designed to serve the comedy rather than to represent a real building. The effect of this is that the house itself becomes a kind of character one with a strange, dreamy quality, where rooms appear and disappear like thoughts during half-sleep. You might watch the show for years and never consciously register that the door to the basement is not where it was 3 seasons ago, or that the staircase has shifted its orientation by 15 degrees, or that a room you have never seen before has apparently been there the whole time, just waiting for a story to need it. The garage is perhaps the most quietly entertaining example of this. In exterior shots of the house, the garage appears with reasonable consistency. But in episodes where the garage itself features as a story element where Peter is doing something in the garage, or where a character emerges from the garage, the interior of that garage is drawn fresh each time, with no particular obligation to match the previous times the garage was shown from the inside. The size of the garage, the contents of the garage, the relationship between the garage door and the driveway, all of these things shift. There was an episode in which the garage contained enough space for an elaborate project that would have required a building considerably larger than the one visible from the street. Nobody mentioned this. The story moved on. Consider also the backyard. The backyard of the Griffin house is a recurring location, picnic scenes, outdoor conversations, the occasional large-scale disaster. The size of this backyard changes fairly dramatically depending on what the episode needs. Sometimes it is a modest suburban rectangle, a patch of grass with a patio and a fence. Other times it expands into something closer to a field, offering enough space for a sequence that would not be physically possible in the smaller version. This is not necessarily wrong. Yards do look different from different angles, in different lights, at different times. But the variation at 31 Spooner Street goes somewhat beyond what different camera angles can explain. There is a room in the house that the show's most dedicated fans have taken to calling the piano room, even though the piano that Lois uses for her teaching appears in what seems like the living room in many episodes, and in a separate dedicated music room in others. Lois is a piano teacher. This is established in the earliest seasons and referred to regularly throughout the show's run. But exactly where she teaches, and whether that location is the living room, a separate front room, or a space that connects to the front hallway through a door that may or may not lead to the same place twice, has never been resolved with any particular clarity. None of this prevents the show from being enjoyable. In fact, the house's flexible architecture is part of what gives it a slightly surreal quality that suits Family Guy's sensibility perfectly. This is a show where the logic of dreams is more operative than the logic of reality, where a cutaway can transport you to ancient Rome and back in under 30 seconds, where a baby has built a time machine in his nursery, and nobody finds this particularly alarming. Of course, the house bends. Of course, rooms appear and disappear. This is Spooner Street. The normal rules do not apply here. But once you start noticing it, once you start watching episodes and asking yourself where exactly that door leads, or wondering why the basement entrance moved between seasons, or trying to figure out how the garage can be both that size from the street and this size from inside, it becomes something you cannot stop noticing. And there is something quietly compelling about that attentiveness. You are no longer just watching Family Guy. You are watching Family Guy, and the show that runs underneath it. The show where the house has its own private geography that exists parallel to the one you can see on screen. The show did eventually make a joke out of this directly. In the season 17 episode that had characters visiting different rooms of the house, the self-referential quality of the house's inconsistency was acknowledged in a way that was playful and brief. The joke was there, and then it was gone, and the house continued to be whatever the next episode needed it to be. That is probably the most honest statement the show ever made about its own architecture. The house is the joke. The house has always been the joke. And after 25 years of watching, the joke is still going. Section 3. The ever-changing past of Peter Griffin. Peter Griffin has a past. Many pasts, actually, depending on which episode you are watching and which season it comes from. He has an origin story that has been told, retold, and quietly contradicted so many times over the course of the show's run that assembling a definitive biography of the man would require a researcher with both extraordinary patience and a very high tolerance for information that does not quite fit together. Let us begin with the basics, which are at least partially stable. Peter Griffin is the father of Meg, Chris, and Stewie. He is married to Lois, née Pewterschmidt. He grew up with a woman named Thelma Griffin, who raised him as her son, and a man named Francis Griffin, who served as his father and whose emotional distance from Peter is a recurring source of pain and comedy across many seasons. He was born in Mexico, though this detail surfaces and then fades in a way that makes you wonder whether the writers always remembered it was established canon. He grew up poor, working class, in contrast to his wife's wealthy upbringing. He attended high school where he was apparently not distinguished by any particular achievement, and he entered adult life as the kind of man who would work in a toy factory and consider that a reasonable career outcome. These are the anchor points of Peter's backstory. They appear consistently enough across enough episodes that they function as established facts. But around these anchors, the details shift, drift, and occasionally contradict each other in ways that range from minor to fairly significant. Start with the question of Peter's biological father. This is a storyline that the show commits to seriously in the Season 5 episode called Peter's Two Dads. In that episode, it is revealed that Francis Griffin is not Peter's biological father. Peter's actual birth father is an Irishman named Mickey McFinnigan, with whom Thelma Griffin had a brief affair. Peter eventually travels to Ireland, meets McFinnigan, and the two develop a tentative relationship. This is presented as a genuine emotional storyline, one with real consequences for how Peter understands his own identity and his complicated relationship with the man who raised him. The problem is that the show sometimes forgets this. Not consistently, the McFinnigan revelation does get referred to in later episodes. But there are moments where Peter speaks about his father or his Irish heritage in ways that imply Francis is his biological parent, or where the complexity of having a biological father he barely knows seems to have simply not registered. The show does not always know what to do with the information it has already generated, and the McFinnigan thread gets picked up and set down again in a rhythm that mirrors the broader pattern of the show's relationship with its own continuity. Then there is the question of Peter's age, which is one of the show's most quietly spectacular pieces of inconsistency. The Family Guy wiki, drawing from specific on-screen references, establishes Peter's age as 45. This was stated in an episode called The Jersey Boar. But the show has also included flash-forwards to the future where Peter describes himself as 58. More importantly, the show's complete disregard for the passage of time means that Peter has been presented as being somewhere in his early to mid-40s for nearly all of the show's 25-year run, during which time the world around him has visibly changed. Smartphones have appeared, cultural references have updated, the political landscape has shifted while Peter himself has remained more or less the same age he was in the early 2000s. This is the foundational paradox of the show's relationship with time, and it bleeds into almost every other inconsistency in the series. Family Guy uses what is sometimes called floating time, a convention common in long-running animated comedies where the present is always now, the characters age very slowly or not at all, and references to real-world time are made loosely rather than with any intention of being tracked. The Simpsons uses the same device. Many animated shows do. But Family Guy uses it in a particularly loose way, one where the consequences for specific established facts, how old is someone, when did something happen, how long have they known each other, become genuinely hard to resolve. Peter's backstory in terms of flashback appearances is a particularly rich source of contradiction. Many episodes include scenes from Peter's past, his childhood, his adolescence, his early adult years before he met Lois, his courtship of Lois. These flashbacks serve as the foundation for specific jokes and story points, and they are generally presented with a degree of earnestness, as if they are drawing from a settled and established history. But across enough flashbacks, the history becomes genuinely inconsistent. Peter's childhood home changes in appearance. His relationship with his father shifts in flavor. The timeline of how he met Lois drifts depending on which episode is doing the establishing. In Meet the Quagmires, a time travel episode from Season 5 that is one of the better examples of the show doing this kind of story, we see a young Peter in 1984 attending a high school party, He is presented as being roughly the same age as the other characters we know: Quagmire, Cleveland, Joe's shadow. This 1984 setting, if taken literally, would put Peter's birth somewhere in the mid to late 1960s, which would make him somewhere around 40 at the time the show premieres in 1999. This is roughly consistent with the established age of 45 if you allow the show a few years of drift. But other episodes present timelines that do not align with this. A flashback to Peter's parents in the 1930s or 1940s, meant to establish family history, places his parents in a context that does not quite square with Peter being born in the 1960s, unless his parents were unusually old when they had him. Other references place specific events in Peter's childhood and decades that do not align with the 1984 party scene. The show is not wrong so much as it is casually indifferent to the task of making all of these pieces fit together into a coherent biography. There is also the matter of Peter's birth in Mexico. This is established in an episode. The detail appears on his birth records and is occasionally referenced as a plot point. But the show's treatment of this fact is inconsistent. There are episodes where Peter's Mexican birth seems to have no bearing on anything, where his nationality and identity are treated as simply and straightforwardly American, where the fact that he was born across the border from where he grew up has no documentary, social, or legal implications. Other episodes treat it as a significant and occasionally troublesome piece of information. The show picks up this thread when it is useful and sets it down when it is not, without any particular concern for whether the result is internally consistent. His education is similarly elastic. Peter has in various episodes demonstrated knowledge, skills, and cultural references that suggest different levels of schooling and different intellectual capacities. The show's foundational premise is that Peter is not particularly intelligent, and this serves the comedy well. His failures of reasoning, his gaps in knowledge, his tendency to misunderstand basic concepts are the raw material for a significant portion of the show's humor. But across 25 years, the specific contours of what Peter does and does not know have shifted considerably. Early episodes gave him a slightly more grounded kind of foolishness, the kind that suggested a man of limited education who nonetheless had functional knowledge of his own world. Later seasons pushed his ignorance to levels that made it difficult to understand how he had managed to hold a job, raise children, or navigate basic social situations. His relationship with his own history is perhaps the most telling detail of all. Peter has described his childhood in different ways in different episodes, with different parents, different memories, and different emotional weights attached to specific events. The show is not contradicting itself out of carelessness so much as drawing from a large pool of Peter's past that is treated as infinitely available. Any aspect of it can be accessed, emphasized, or revised when the current story needs it. The past is not a fixed thing for Peter Griffin, it is a resource. And there is something philosophically interesting about that, if you are in the mood for philosophical interest at this hour. The way Family Guy treats Peter's past is not entirely unlike the way memory actually works, not as a faithful recording of what happened, but as a constantly reconstructed narrative that emphasizes what is useful in the plaintive moment. The difference is that memory reconstruction is something that happens to us, while Family Guy's treatment of Peter's past is something that happens because of 24 different writers working across 25 years without always reading each other's scripts. One particularly notable inconsistency involves Peter's relationship with his own hair. In an episode called Hefty Shades of Grey, Peter's hair turns white as a consequence of a ghost hunting incident, and this is explicitly established as permanent. The new white hair becomes central to the plot, leading directly to Peter being hired as a news reporter. The next episode, Trump Guy, features Peter with his original brown hair, the white entirely gone, with no explanation offered for the reversal of what had just been declared an irreversible change. This is a relatively small example compared to the larger biographical inconsistencies, but it illustrates something important about how the show handles its own continuity. Something is established as permanent, as significant, as having real consequences, and then the next episode begins as if it never happened. This is not a mistake born of negligence, but a structural feature of how the show approaches the relationship between individual episodes and the larger ongoing story. Each episode is in some sense complete in itself, and the connective tissue between episodes is loose enough that a permanent change in one can disappear entirely in the next without anyone in the writer's room feeling obligated to address the discrepancy. Peter's various near-death experiences, his resurrections, his physical damage that would be catastrophic in any real-world context, these are part of the same pattern. He has been shot, blown up, severely maimed, and killed in ways that would, in any other context, have permanent consequences. The show absorbs all of this damage and resets. By the time the next episode begins, Peter is walking around at his usual weight and height, with his original hair color, in full physical health, with no trace of whatever happened to him last week. This is the logic of cartoon physics, and it is applied to Peter more thoroughly than to almost any other character on the show. What makes this interesting rather than simply frustrating is the cumulative effect of all these resets. You end up with a character who is both entirely familiar, you know exactly what Peter Griffin is going to do when placed in almost any situation, and entirely mysterious, because the specific history that shaped him into this person is a mosaic of contradictions that cannot be fully assembled. He is a man with 1,000 pasts and one permanent present. Section 4, Brian Griffin's Impossible Biography. If Peter's contradictions are the contradictions of a man whose history has been assembled carelessly over 2 decades, Brian Griffin's contradictions are something more structurally interesting. They are the contradictions of a character whose fundamental nature, what he is, how he got here, what his relationship with the world actually looks like, has been established in ways that are, when examined together, genuinely irreconcilable. Brian is a dog. This is the baseline. He is a white Labrador retriever who lives with the Griffin family, walks on 2 legs, drinks martinis, has complex emotional relationships, attempts to write novels and screenplays, holds opinions on literature and politics, and navigates the social world of Quahog with a degree of self-awareness that most of the human characters lack. He is also, in some contexts that the show invokes when it serves a joke, simply a dog. He fears the vacuum cleaner, he reliably defecates on the front lawn, he runs excitedly toward the sound of a bag of dog food being shaken. The show has never fully committed to either version of Brian. This is deliberate. The comedy of his character depends on the oscillation between his human-level sophistication and his occasional reversion to dog behavior. But this deliberate ambiguity has generated some of the show's most genuinely puzzling continuity problems. Begin with how Brian came to live with the Griffin family. The origin story established in the early seasons, specifically in the episode Brian, Portrait of a Dog from Season 1, indicates that Brian was found as an adult dog by Peter, who picked him up as a stray. This story is told again in Road to Rhode Island, a Season 2 episode, where Brian's backstory is explored more fully. He was abandoned and found by Peter while wandering alone. The implication of both these tellings is that Brian came to the family as a grown dog, with a formed personality and no puppyhood within the Griffin household. But the episode The Man with Two Brians, from Season 7, includes a scene in which Brian shows the Griffin family home movies of himself as a puppy. The family watches these videos with fondness. Brian as a puppy, at the Griffin house, on video. If Brian was found as an adult stray, these videos cannot exist in the form the episode presents them. You cannot have home movies of a puppy phase that, according to the established origin story, took place somewhere other than the Griffin house before Brian was part of the family. The show does not address this. The home movie scene plays, the family reacts warmly, and the contradiction with the established origin story simply sits there, unresolved, like a guest at a party who nobody introduced. Then there is the matter of Brian's age. The show has established Brian as being 8 years old. At one point in the series, this is stated directly in The Man with Two Brians, and more recently his age has been updated to 10, which means the show acknowledges that some time passes for Brian even if it does not always acknowledge the same passage for other characters. In dog years, 8 human years is approximately 56 dog years, and 10 human years is 70 dog years. The show itself invokes these dog year calculations when it is convenient. Here is where the math becomes genuinely startling. In Season 6, the episode The Former Life of Brian introduces Dylan Flanagan, a 13-year-old boy who is revealed to be Brian's son. Brian fathered this child with a woman named Tracy Flanagan before the events of the show during a previous relationship. But Brian is, at that point, 8 years old. You cannot be 8 years old and have fathered a 13-year-old child. This is not a matter of interpretation, it is a simple mathematical impossibility. Even accounting for dog years, even invoking the argument that in dog year terms Brian would have been old enough, The show also established in the same episode that Brian's dog year age cannot be straightforwardly applied to his reproductive history because the son he has allegedly fathered is a fully human child. Dylan Flanagan is not half dog, he is entirely human. There is no physical mechanism by which a dog, even a dog who walks upright and drinks martinis, can father a human child, and the show does not attempt to explain this. Dylan simply exists, is acknowledged as Brian's son, and the biological impossibility of his existence is left entirely unexamined. Stewie actually asks about this, in what may be the show's most self-aware acknowledgement of one of its own plot holes. When Dylan is introduced and his age is mentioned, Stewie raises the obvious question: how can Brian be Dylan's father if the math does not work? Brian responds by invoking dog years by dog year reckoning. He explains he would have been old enough. This explanation addresses the age math while doing nothing whatsoever for the equally pressing question of how a dog fathers a human son. But Stewie's question is asked and answered, the scene moves on, and the audience is left to decide whether they found the dog year explanation satisfying or whether they are still sitting with the image of a white Labrador whose offspring somehow emerged entirely human. Dylan returns in season 12, in an episode called Brian's a Bad Father, now established as a teenager working on a Disney children's show. Brian attempts to exploit his son's professional connections to get himself a writing job. This is consistent with certain aspects of Brian's character in the later seasons, the selfishness, the willingness to use personal relationships for professional gain, but it also deepens the puzzle of Dylan's existence. Because by season 12, Brian is 10 years old. If Dylan is roughly 13 or older by this point, the gap between Brian's age and his son's age has become mathematically absurd by any calculation that attempts to account for actual time. The origin of Brian within the Griffin family has a second established version that adds further texture to the confusion. The season 9 episode Who's Brian Now reveals that Brian had a previous family before the Griffins, an owner he was bonded with, a life he led before Peter found him on the side of the road. This is a separate, incompatible layer of backstory that sits alongside the existing origin story, without being reconciled with it. What is Brian's earliest memory of his family life? The answer depends on which season you are watching. In the earliest seasons, it is Peter finding him as a stray. In later seasons, it is a more complex history that involves a previous owner, a puppyhood that may have been recorded on video, and a son whose existence defies biology. These layers do not resolve into a single coherent story, they accumulate, each new episode adding another tile to a mosaic that no longer matches any of its original patterns. Brian's drinking is another element that the show treats with considerable inconsistency. In the early seasons, Brian's relationship with alcohol is established as one of his defining characteristics. He drinks martinis, he drinks wine, he has what the show gently acknowledges is a drinking problem that he uses to cope with his failures and disappointments. This is presented as a real personality trait, one that has real consequences in his relationships and his attempts to function. In later seasons, Brian's drinking becomes more of a background detail, a character shorthand that appears in some episodes and is absent from others without any pattern that reflects genuine character development. There are episodes in the later run where Brian's alcoholism appears to be fully operational, contributing to genuinely destructive behavior. There are other episodes in the same seasons where Brian drinks socially and moderately with no indication that this is unusual or problematic. The show cannot quite decide whether Brian's drinking is a defining character flaw or a recurring prop. His writing career presents similar inconsistencies. In the earliest seasons, Brian's status as a failed novelist is one of his central traits. He has been working on a novel for years, he cannot finish it. This failure is a source of both humor and genuine pathos. It represents the gap between who Brian thinks he is and who he has actually managed to become. This is good character writing. The gap between aspiration and achievement, especially when the aspiration is intellectual and the achievement is being the family dog who drinks too much, is funny and a little sad in the right proportions. The novel eventually gets finished and published, then universally panned, and Brian's relationship with his own writing ambitions shifts across the remaining seasons in ways that do not follow a straight line of development. He writes other things. Some succeed, some fail. His identity as a writer is sometimes central and sometimes forgotten. In the season 9 episode Brian Writes a Bestseller, he produces a self-help book that becomes enormously successful, leading to a spectacular collapse in his behavior and his relationships. But this success is then essentially forgotten by subsequent episodes. which treat Brian's writing career as perpetually aspirational rather than as something he has already succeeded at, however briefly. Brian's relationship with Lois is another thread the show picks up and sets down repeatedly. In the early seasons, Brian's feelings for Lois, a quiet, suppressed attraction that he keeps carefully contained, are established as part of his character. He admires her, he is drawn to her, he would never act on it, but the feeling is real and is treated as real by the show. In later seasons, this thread surfaces occasionally in episodes that make it a focal point, and then disappears again in the episodes that follow. The show knows this element of Brian's character exists, but it does not always know what to do with it, and the result is a character relationship that oscillates between meaningful and forgotten. The question of who can actually hear and understand Brian is different from the same question as it applies to Stewie, but related. Brian speaks to people throughout the show, and they respond to him. In some contexts, this is treated as entirely normal. Brian has full conversations with human characters, makes arguments, expresses opinions, and is engaged with as a rational participant in the dialogue. In other contexts, the show seems to remember that Brian is technically a dog and that not everyone should be treating him as a human peer. These two modes of engagement with Brian's nature have never been reconciled into a consistent position that the show maintains across episodes. The result is a character biography that is rich, detailed, and deeply contradictory, a body of established fact that cannot be assembled into a single coherent life story, not because the writers were not paying attention, but because the character was built over 25 years by many different hands, each drawing from the Brian they knew without fully accounting for the Brian that others had already written. Section 5. Stewie Griffin and the Rules. Nobody agreed on. Stewie Griffin is, on paper, one of the most specific and precisely defined characters in American animated television. He is 1 year old. He speaks in a British accent that sounds as if it was assembled from equal parts theatrical villain, prep school prefect, and 19th century drawing room wit. He has, from his first appearance in the pilot episode, been in possession of a mind sophisticated enough to build advanced weapons, conceive of and execute detailed plans, and express himself with a vocabulary and syntactic complexity that would be impressive in a 40-year-old academic. He lives in a nursery with baby toys and a crib, and he has spent most of his existence planning either world domination or the specific elimination of his mother. That is the character as designed. Now here is what happens when you try to find the rules by which this character operates across 25 seasons. The most fundamental question about Stewie Griffin is also the most consistently unanswered. Can the other characters hear him? This sounds like it should have an easy answer. The show established in its early seasons that Stewie existed in a state of partial communication. Most of the adult characters in his life heard him only as babble, as the indistinct sounds of an infant, while the audience heard his elaborate speeches in full. This created a comedic gap between what Stewie was actually saying and what the people around him perceived. It was a foundational joke, the baby who says extraordinary things that nobody acknowledges. Brian was the exception. Brian, from early in the show's run, could hear and understand Stewie perfectly. Their dialogue was mutual, functional, and formed the basis of a friendship that became one of the show's central relationships. This was established clearly enough that it functioned as a rule. Brian hears Stewie, most others do not. Except that the rule was never fully honored. Almost from the beginning, there were moments where characters who theoretically could not understand Stewie responded to him in ways that suggested they could. There were conversations between Stewie and Chris that implied mutual comprehension. There were moments where Lois, who theoretically heard only babble, reacted to something Stewie said in a way that made no sense unless she had understood the specific content of what he was saying. There were strangers, encountered in single episodes, who spoke to Stewie as if his elaborate sentences were perfectly audible and comprehensible. The show even acknowledged this inconsistency within its own dialogue. In Love, Blackshally, Brian and Stewie have a brief meta-conversation about which characters can hear Stewie and which cannot, debating whether a specific character they are discussing falls into the comprehending or non-comprehending category. This is the show winking at its own problem, acknowledging the inconsistency while doing nothing structural to resolve it. Seth MacFarlane offered his own explanation in interviews over the years. Everyone, MacFarlane suggested, can understand what Stewie is saying. The reason characters like Peter and Lois do not respond to his elaborate speeches is not that they cannot hear him, but that they do not take him seriously. He is a 1-year-old. Adults ignore babies. This is the explanation. Everyone hears Stewie. Few bother to engage with what he is saying. This is a reasonable and generous explanation, but it does not fully account for the many episodes where Stewie says something specific and serious, a threat, a request, a genuine communication, and the adult character he is addressing responds in a way that makes clear they have not understood the words. There are episodes where Stewie's ability to go undetected in plans and schemes depends entirely on the adults around him not understanding him, and where that inability to understand is functional rather than merely social inattention. If everyone hears Stewie but some people choose to ignore him, the mechanics of many stories break down entirely. The question of what Stewie can build is similarly inconsistent. His nursery, across the show's run, has contained a time machine, various weapons, a portal to other dimensions, a device capable of mind control, a shrink ray, a growth ray, and numerous other pieces of technology that would represent the pinnacle of human achievement if they existed at all. This is the core of the evil genius baby joke, the contrast between the diaper and the doomsday device, between the high chair and the hyperdrive. But the capabilities of Stewie's technology vary dramatically from episode to episode. In some stories, the time machine is a powerful and versatile tool that can navigate to specific historical moments with precision and return from them cleanly. In other stories, the same technology fails, malfunctions, or has significant limitations that the episode requires for its plot. The rules governing how Stewie's inventions work are not consistent rules. They are episode-specific rules, established at the start of whatever story needs them and discarded at the end. The time machine is the most prominent example because it has been used so often. In the early seasons, the time machine's existence and capabilities were treated as an extraordinary fact, something remarkable and dangerous. By the later seasons, time travel has been used so frequently that it has become almost mundane characters, treated as a familiar plot device rather than as a genuinely astonishing technology. But even as it becomes familiar, the rules by which it operates continue to shift. In some episodes, changes made in the past permanently alter the present. In others, time travel operates on the principle that the timeline is mostly resilient and snaps back into shape after disturbances. The show never commits to one model of how time travel works, and the result is a series of time travel stories that are individually often charming, but collectively impossible to reconcile with each other. Stewie's famous death count is another dimension of this. He has, in various episodes, died or appeared to die, or been placed in situations that should have resulted in death and returned in the next scene or the next episode without any explanation. Sometimes these apparent deaths are played as dreams or simulations. Sometimes they are simply never acknowledged. Meg, as the show's designated punching bag, has been launched into the vacuum of space as a throwaway gag and appeared in the following scene entirely unaffected. Stewie has experienced similarly lethal situations and similarly returned from them without comment. The world domination plots, Stewie's defining characteristic in the first 3 seasons, are perhaps the most discussed aspect of his character's evolution, and their gradual disappearance from the show represents the show's most deliberately acknowledged inconsistency. The two-parter Stewie Kills Lois and Lois Kills Stewie in Season 6 was, as the narrative context suggests, intended as something of a final chapter for this version of Stewie, an acknowledgement that the evil genius storyline was being set aside. Stewie achieves his goals, takes over the world, becomes the dictator he always said he would become, and then it is revealed to be a simulation, a computer program running on a screen in his nursery. This is a fascinating narrative choice because it is simultaneously satisfying and deeply unsatisfying. Satisfying because it gives the evil genius baby his moment, his actual, canonical, on-screen victory. Unsatisfying because the reveal immediately takes the victory away, resetting everything to exactly where it was before the episode began. The show could not commit to the consequences of Stewie's ambitions actually being realized, so it gave him a simulated victory and used the simulation to retire the ambitions. After this two-parter, Stewie's character shifts more fully toward the emotional, insecure, friendship-oriented version that has largely defined him in the show's later years. He still has his technology, he still has his British accent. He still has moments of genuine menace, but the sustained, serial pursuit of world domination and the specific obsession with killing Lois, these are largely retired. The character who exists in Season 20 and beyond is recognizably Stewie in voice and appearance, but is operating with a fundamentally different set of motivations and emotional textures than the character of Season 1. Whether this constitutes a plot hole is a matter of perspective. The writers would say this is character development. Critics of the show's trajectory would say this is the retirement of one of animation's most original character concepts in favor of something more conventionally relatable and emotionally accessible. Both observations have merit, and neither invalidates the other. What is not in dispute is that the Stewie of Season 1 and the Stewie of Season 20 are following different internal rules, and that the transition between these two versions was never fully explained within the story. It happened gradually, through accumulated choices, until one day you looked at the character on screen and realized that the rules had changed while nobody was making a formal announcement. The question of Stewie's sexuality, introduced through jokes and implications, starting in the show's middle seasons and developed into a recurring thematic element, is another dimension of his character that the show has treated with notable inconsistency. The show makes jokes about Stewie's sexuality frequently, often in ways that imply attraction to male characters. But the show also never commits to a definitive statement about Stewie's sexual identity, partly because committing to a definitive statement would mean being accountable to it in subsequent episodes, and partly because the ambiguity itself is the engine of the jokes. The result is a character whose sexuality is both frequently referenced and never resolved, a source of comedy that exists precisely because of its indeterminacy. All of this creates a character who is simultaneously one of the show's most memorable creations and one of its most internally contradictory. Stewie is recognizable, iconic, quotable, beloved, and the specific version of Stewie you encounter in any given episode depends on which aspects of his established character that episode needs. He is an evil genius baby who is also a lonely one-year-old looking for connection. He is a weapons builder and a time traveler, and a person who cries when Brian does not want to be his friend. He is all of these things at once, and none of them quite consistently, and somehow the whole arrangement has held together for 25 years. Section 6. The Quagmire Paradox. Glenn Quagmire is, on the surface, one of the simpler characters in the Family Guy ensemble. He is Peter's neighbor and one of his 3 best friends. He is the sexually obsessive one, a personality type that the show established from his first appearance and has maintained with remarkable consistency across all of the seasons the show has run. He has a square jaw, a high-pitched laugh that has become one of the show's most imitated sounds, and a red Hawaiian shirt that functions as his visual signature in the way that Peter's green shirt and Brian's white coat function for their respective characters. He is also 61 years old. This was established with what the show treated as complete seriousness in the episode Foxy Lady, where his driver's license is clearly visible on screen and lists his age. 61 years old. This is a man in his early 60s, a fact that the show presents as a deliberate joke. Quagmire looks considerably younger than 61, and his youthful appearance is explained, in passing, by his habit of consuming carrots. The problem with this age is that it creates ripple effects across multiple other episodes that the show never quite resolves. Consider the episode Underage Peter, in which Mayor Adam West raises the town's drinking age to 50. Peter and his friends are unable to buy alcohol because they are all under this new limit. The solution the group eventually finds is to use Brian as their proxy. Brian is 7 years old in human years, which in dog years puts him at 56, and 56 is above the new drinking age of 50. So Brian can buy alcohol on behalf of the group. This entire plot makes sense only if Quagmire is also under 50. But Quagmire, as established by his driver's license in Foxy Lady, is 61. If Quagmire were 61 at the time of Underage Peter, the entire episode's premise collapses, because Quagmire would simply have bought the alcohol himself. Nobody in the episode points this out. Nobody suggests asking Quagmire. The solution of using Brian's dog year age is deployed as if Quagmire's 61-year-old status does not exist. You could argue that Quagmire's age was being exaggerated in Foxy Lady for comic effect, and that his real age is actually closer to Peter's somewhere in the early to mid-40s. This argument is supported by various flashback episodes, particularly Meet the Quagmires, which shows Quagmire and Peter as roughly contemporaries at a 1984 high school party. If both men were 18 or so in 1984, they would both be around 39 or 40 at the show's 1999 start, which would place Quagmire in his mid to late 40s by the show's present day, nowhere near 61. The show's own internal fan wiki notes this age as vague and acknowledges that his driver's license age of 61 is contradicted by numerous other episodes. The explanation sometimes offered that Quagmire was inflating his age on his license for some unspecified reason, possibly related to his interest in older women or his attempt to access certain age-restricted activities, is one of those retroactive explanations that requires you to do significant interpretive work that the show itself does not provide. Quagmire's backstory has other notable inconsistencies. His legal name, as revealed in later seasons, is Glenn Quagelchek. Quagmire is an adopted name. His history as a Navy pilot is established and occasionally referenced. His family relationships, a sister named Brenda, a father who undergoes a gender transition and becomes Anna Lee Quagmire, are introduced in individual episodes and then treated with variable levels of consistency in subsequent ones. His daughter, fathered in a brief relationship established in a Season 8 episode, is introduced and then largely recedes from his story. The episode where Quagmire's wig is revealed, establishing that he has been bald the whole time and concealing it with a hairpiece, directly contradicts a previous episode in which he is shown to have grown his hair out, during a period where his personality changes. If his hair is a wig he has been wearing continuously, he cannot also have grown his actual hair out. The show did not appear to notice this when writing the wig revelation. Quagmire's relationship with Brian is one of the show's more dramatically interesting dynamics, but it too has consistency problems. Their mutual dislike, particularly Quagmire's contempt for Brian, is established in Season 8, with the famous speech in which Quagmire lays out, in considerable detail, everything he finds reprehensible about the dog. This speech is memorable, well-written, and clearly intended as a moment of genuine character insight. Quagmire is allowed to be right about Brian in a way that breaks from the usual dynamic of these two characters. But the speech also describes Quagmire's long-standing feelings about Brian as if they are feelings that have existed throughout the show's run, a slow build of resentment that is only now finding expression. This framing requires you to reread every prior scene between Quagmire and Brian as being colored by this quiet hostility, which is a reasonable reading, except that many of their earlier scenes together do not support it. There are episodes from the show's earlier seasons where Quagmire and Brian interact with no particular tension, where they are simply two members of the group functioning normally, with no sign of the deep contempt that Quagmire later presents as having been present all along. The show's handling of Quagmire's behavior toward women is also consistently inconsistent in a specific way. The premise of the character is that his behavior represents an extreme, comedic version of certain masculine attitudes and behaviors. The show both plays this for laughs and, at various points, treats it as genuinely problematic. There are episodes where other characters react to Quagmire's behavior with distaste, where his actions are framed as wrong rather than merely transgressive. But this framing is itself inconsistent. The show cannot decide whether Quagmire is a satirical caricature of a certain type of man or a character whose behavior is genuinely being criticized, and it oscillates between these two registers without ever settling in one place. The result is a character who is extremely memorable, extremely recognizable, and extremely inconsistent in the specifics of his established biography. His age does not fit his own flashback history. His hair does not fit both the established facts about his hair. His feelings about Brian do not fit the earlier episodes in which those feelings are supposedly already present. And none of this prevents him from being one of the show's most effective secondary characters, because the inconsistencies are individual and episodic, while the character's core personality, the laugh, the jaw, the red shirt, the endlessly recycled joke is as consistent as anything in the show. Section 7, Meg Griffin and the father she has or doesn't. Of all the plot holes in Family Guy, the one involving Meg Griffin's biological parentage is perhaps the most dramatically interesting, because it is not a simple continuity error, but a piece of information that was deliberately introduced, acknowledged within the story, and then half forgotten in a way that created a contradiction the show never went back to resolve. In the Season 3 episode Screwed the Pooch, Brian is placed in a situation where he must demonstrate his knowledge of the Griffin family in order to prove his fitness as a parent. Peter asks him questions. Brian answers. One of the answers is that Meg's real father is a man named Stan Thompson. The show is quite specific about this. Brian knows it, Peter is aware of it, And the reveal is structured as a piece of information that the audience is seeing for the first time, even though the characters have apparently known it for some time. Meg herself does not hear this. She is wearing headphones during the exchange, listening to music, and the revelation of her biological parentage passes entirely over her head. This is a reasonably well-constructed comic moment. The dramatic irony of Meg being present for the revelation of something life-altering about herself while being unable to hear it is exactly the kind of situational comedy. The early seasons did well. The problem comes several seasons later, in the Season 9 episode Not All Dogs Go to Heaven. In this episode, Brian and Meg have a conversation in which Brian tells her that life is not fair and offers as evidence of this unfairness that she looks like Peter. This is the show clearly implying that Peter is Meg's biological father. You look like him. He is your dad. But that cannot be true if the earlier established fact that Meg's father is Stan Thompson is correct. The two pieces of information are not compatible. Either Meg's father is Stan Thompson, a man who is not Peter, or Meg resembles Peter because Peter is her biological father. Both cannot be true simultaneously. And the show established the Stan Thompson fact with enough clarity and specificity that it cannot reasonably be dismissed as a throwaway gag that was never meant to be taken seriously. The Family Guy Wiki's diplomatic position is that Brian may have been lying in the "not all dogs go to heaven" conversation, that he told Meg she looked like Peter as a cruel psychological tactic in the midst of an argument, without that statement having any bearing on whether Peter is actually her biological father. This reading is possible but requires you to believe that Brian was deliberately making a false statement about a deeply personal matter in order to wound Meg more effectively, which is, admittedly, not outside the range of Brian's behavior in the later seasons. But it is also not the reading that the episode itself seems to invite. The more straightforward explanation is that the writer of the "Not All Dogs Go to Heaven" scene rather did not know about the Stan Thompson revelation from Season 3 or decided to disregard it. This happens. 25 seasons of television, dozens of writers, hundreds of episodes, people miss things. Facts established years ago in the room of a different writer do not always make it into the collective working memory of everyone currently on staff. The Stan Thompson fact is not referenced frequently enough to be in the front of everyone's mind when they are writing scenes involving Meg's parentage. But the effect of this particular oversight is interesting because it leaves Meg's parentage in a state of genuine ambiguity. The show has, on different occasions, established both that she has a biological father who is not Peter and that she resembles Peter in a way that implies shared genetics. These two facts cannot coexist, and yet there they are, sitting in the same fictional universe, never reconciled. There is also the matter of the flashback, in which Peter and Lois are revealed to have attempted to abandon Meg at a fire station when she was an infant. This is presented as a joke. The audience is invited to laugh at the idea that her parents tried to give her away before she could walk. But this flashback, if taken as part of the show's established history, exists alongside the Stan Thompson revelation in a way that raises additional questions. If Stan Thompson is Meg's biological father, what does that mean for the circumstances of her birth and the decision of Peter and Lois to initially attempt to abandon her? The show never explores this, because the flashback exists as a self-contained joke, rather than as a piece of continuity that must account for the other established facts about Meg's origins. What emerges from all of this is a character whose fundamental identity, specifically the most basic fact of who her parents are, is uncertain in ways that the show has never bothered to clarify. Meg Griffin does not know who she is, in the most literal possible sense, because the show cannot quite agree on who she is either. Her treatment at the hands of her family is similarly inconsistent in ways that go beyond the deliberate comedic choice to use her as the group's designated target. There are episodes scattered across the show's run, where Peter and Meg have genuine moments of connection, where Peter's awareness of his failure as a father leads to something resembling authentic remorse, where the relationship between them takes on a quality that suggests real feeling beneath the abuse and dismissal. There is an episode called Peter's Sister where the cycle of abuse Peter inflicts on Meg is contextualized by the revelation that Peter was himself abused by his sister growing up, that his cruelty toward his daughter is the inherited pattern of a man who learned from his own pain. The episode is genuinely affecting. And then the next episode begins and Peter treats Meg exactly as he always has, and the emotional insight of the previous story simply does not exist anymore. This is the reset button applied to the most emotionally significant relationship in the show's later seasons, and it is applied with particular brutality to a character who was already in a position of consistent powerlessness. Meg's voice actress Mila Kunis has spoken publicly about the character's treatment and the show's approach to her. The actress's position has been one of gracious acceptance. Meg's suffering is the joke, and Kunis understood that from the beginning. But the fact that the abuse became so extreme across certain seasons that it generated real-world discomfort, to the point where people applied the character's catchphrase of dismissal to Kunis herself in public, is evidence that the show had crossed from satirical exaggeration into something that landed differently for people who encountered it in the world outside the television. The trajectory of Meg's character from ordinary teenage girl in Season 1 to designated family punching bag by Season 8, and then slowly back towards something more dignified by the show's later seasons, after more women joined the writing staff, is one of the show's most legible narratives about its own creative choices. But within that trajectory, the specific facts of her identity, her parentage, her relationship with her family remain scattered and unresolved, pieces of a character biography that the show could never quite agree on. Section 8, Cleveland, Joe, and the neighborhood that rewrites itself. The supporting cast of Family Guy, specifically the three friends who round out Peter's regular social group, represent a distinct category of plot hole that is worth exploring separately. Cleveland Brown, Joe Swanson, and Glenn Quagmire are each substantial enough characters to have generated their own continuity problems, and some of those problems interact with the broader inconsistencies of the show in interesting ways. Cleveland Brown is the most complex case because his story extends beyond Family Guy itself. Cleveland left the show at the end of Season 8 to star in his own spin-off, The Cleveland Show, which ran from 2009 to 2013 on Fox. During this period, Cleveland was absent from Family Guy entirely. When the Cleveland Show ended and Cleveland returned to Quahog, he came back in a Season 12 episode called He's Black with a New Wife, a Stepson, and a family configuration quite different from the one he had in his Family Guy years. The integration of Cleveland's spin-off history into the main show is handled with reasonable acknowledgement. The show does not pretend his years away did not happen. But the specific details of his personal history, particularly his first marriage to Loretta and the circumstances surrounding their divorce, sit in a complicated relationship with some earlier episodes. Loretta's affair with Quagmire, the story that drove Cleveland's departure from his first marriage, was a significant plot point. But earlier in the show's run, there had been a moment where Peter and Brian discover Loretta in a compromising situation and cannot identify the man involved. Brian describes the man only as a skinny white guy. Quagmire is skinny and white. This should have been a clue immediately recognizable to anyone who knew Quagmire. The fact that neither Peter nor Brian connects this to their close friend and neighbor is presented without comment, but it sits uncomfortably with the show's established presentation of these characters as people who spend the majority of their time together and know each other well. Cleveland's manner of speaking, his deliberate, measured pace, was established in an episode as the result of a head injury. He had previously spoken as an auctioneer, fast and clipped, until the blow to his head changed his speech pattern permanently. This is specific and concrete enough to feel like established canon, but the show's use of this fact across subsequent episodes is inconsistent. Cleveland's speech is always slow and deliberate, but the head injury origin of that speech pattern is not always honored in episodes that deal with Cleveland's history. The fact appears and then becomes a background detail, rather than something the show actively remembers. Joe Swanson has his own particular set of complications, and they center primarily on his injury and the episodes that engaged with it directly. Joe is a police officer who uses a wheelchair he was shot in the spine while apprehending a criminal, leaving him paralyzed from the waist down. This is established in his first appearance in Season 1, in the episode A Hero Sits Next Door. The injury gives Joe his central characteristic. He is fiercely capable and determined despite his disability, and the early seasons treated this with a degree of earnestness that made him one of the more grounded secondary characters. The episode Believe It or Not, Joe's Walking on Air in Season 6 changes this established status quo dramatically. Joe undergoes an operation and regains the ability to walk. Temporarily freed from his wheelchair, Joe becomes a different person, more arrogant, less empathetic, less attached to the friends who supported him during his years of disability. The episode plays out as a meditation on identity and how disability shapes character, and it is interesting enough in its premise. By the end, Joe is back in his wheelchair. But the mechanics of how this happens are strange. Bonnie, having had enough of Joe's new personality, attempts to shoot him in the back to re-paralyze him, but she misses. Joe shoots himself, successfully paralyzing himself again. The episode then essentially resets Joe to his Season 1 status quo, as if the years and the walking and the personality changes simply did not occur. This is the reset button deployed as a physical action within the story. The character literally shoots himself back to his original state so the show can continue with its familiar dynamic. The reset is complete enough that subsequent seasons mostly treat Joe's disability as simply his established condition, rather than as something with a complicated history involving temporary recovery and self-administered re-injury. The history exists in those episodes. It just does not always seem to inform how the character is understood in the seasons that follow. Bonnie Swanson's pregnancy is the single most publicly acknowledged plot hole in the show's run, and it deserves its due. Bonnie appears in the show's first season in A Hero Sits Next Door, visibly pregnant. She remains visibly pregnant for episode after episode, season after season, year after year. The show acknowledges this directly. Peter comments on it in the Season 4 episode Blind Ambition, telling Bonnie that she has been pregnant for 6 years and should either have the baby or not. This is the show winking at itself, as it often does, acknowledging an inconsistency by making a joke out of it. But the pregnancy continues. By the time Bonnie gives birth to her daughter Susie in the Season 7 episode Ocean's 3.5, she has been pregnant for the entirety of the show's first 7 seasons. The official count from the show's own wiki puts the pregnancy at the first 116 episodes. A human pregnancy lasting across 116 episodes of television, broadcast across 7 years, is not a plot hole in the traditional sense. It is a deliberate creative choice, a running gag elevated to the scale of an institutional fact. The show knew Bonnie was pregnant for an extraordinary amount of time. It made jokes about this. What makes it a genuine inconsistency rather than simply an extended joke is the way it interacts with other established facts about the Swanson family. Bonnie and Joe have a teenage son named Kevin who existed before the show began, established as a real presence in their family life. If Bonnie became pregnant with Susie before or around the time of the show's beginning, and remained pregnant for 7 years of broadcast time, and Kevin is already a teenager when Bonnie is first shown pregnant, the ages and the timeline of the Swanson family simply do not add up in any way that produces coherent mathematics. Kevin's own history is a separate thread of inconsistency. He appears briefly in earlier seasons, exists in the background, and then essentially disappears for long stretches of the show's run. When he returns in Season 10, there is significant dramatic weight placed on his return. He is then largely absent again. The show treats Kevin's presence in the Swanson family as something that is relevant when a specific story needs him, and irrelevant in all other circumstances, which is a perfectly functional approach to a secondary character, but one that means his age, his development, and his relationship with his parents are all somewhat foggy. The broader neighborhood of Spooner Street has its own geographical inconsistencies that are worth noting. The relative positions of the houses on Spooner Street, the Griffins at 31, the Swansons at 33, the Quagmire residents next door have been depicted with enough variability across different episodes that mapping the street with any precision is impossible. The distances between houses, the visual relationships between them, and occasionally the addresses themselves have drifted across the seasons. These are relatively minor compared to the character inconsistencies, but they contribute to the general sense of Spooner Street as a street that exists less as a physical location and more as a gathering of familiar relationships arranged in whatever spatial configuration serves the current story. Section 9 Time, Aging, and the Children Who Never Grew Up. One of the most fundamental and quietly fascinating contradictions in Family Guy is the one involving time itself. The show has been running for 25 years. It premiered in 1999. It has referenced real-world events across all of the decades since political changes, cultural shifts, technological evolution, the rise of social media, events that everyone in the audience remembers and that the show has directly engaged with as current news. And yet the characters of Family Guy have not aged in any meaningful way across those 25 years. Peter is essentially the same age he was in 1999. Lois has not visibly aged. Brian is slightly older. The show has acknowledged his age creeping from 6 to 10, but is not elderly in the way that a dog approaching his own biological lifespan would be. Quagmire, despite being 61 when that detail was established, appears no older in recent seasons than he did in the mid-2000s. This is the floating time convention, and as noted earlier, it is a deliberate structural choice rather than an oversight. But it creates specific problems when it interacts with the show's children, because Meg, Chris, and Stewie occupy a different categorical relationship with time than the adults do, and the show has handled that relationship inconsistently. Stewie is 1 year old. He has been 1 year old since 1999. The show has never moved him from infancy to toddlerhood in any definitive sense, and certainly not toward childhood. He remains in a crib, in a nursery, wearing the same yellow shirt and diaper he has worn since the pilot. This is a deliberate choice. Aging Stewie out of infancy would mean aging him out of the core premise of his character, which is the contrast between baby and brilliant mind. 1 year old Stewie with a British accent and a time machine is a specific and iconic image. A 7-year-old Stewie with a British accent and a time machine is a fundamentally different character. But there are episodes that imply the passage of real time for Stewie in ways that complicate this fixed infancy. There are moments where Stewie references his own development, his own history, events that happened before the current episode in a temporal sequence that implies actual time has passed. There are flashback episodes that place Stewie in specific historical moments from the show's past, acknowledging that the show has a history extending back decades, while Stewie in the present is still wearing the same diaper he was wearing in those historical moments. Meg and Chris are a more complicated case, because they are not infants and the show has not committed to holding their ages fixed in the same way. Meg is established early in the show as being approximately 16 years old, a high school junior. Chris is roughly 13. These ages are stated in various contexts across the early seasons, and yet across 25 years of broadcast time, Meg has not graduated from high school, Chris has not become a teenager approaching adulthood, and neither character has aged in any way that reflects the actual passage of time since the show's premiere. This is not specific to Family Guy. Most animated comedy families operate similarly. Homer Simpson's children have not aged meaningfully in 35 years of The Simpsons. The floating time convention is the industry standard, but Family Guy's use of it is particularly visible because the show has engaged so directly with real-world current events, events that have a specific temporal relationship with the show's history, while maintaining a cast of characters who exist outside of time. The contradictions this creates are most visible in episodes that engage directly with Meg's situation as a teenager. She is, in any given episode, a current high school student dealing with current social dynamics, current technology, current cultural references, but she has been a high school student for 25 years. The social world she navigates, the references her peers make, the technology available to her, these have all evolved with the real world. Meg has not. She is perpetually 16 in a world that keeps moving forward around her. There are episodes where characters reference specific things that happened in the past of the show, memories, established events, relationships that were formed in earlier seasons. The temporal relationship between these memories and the show's present is always vague. How long ago did this happen? The show resists answering this in any specific way, because answering it would require committing to a timeline that would reveal just how little the characters have aged relative to how much time has actually passed. Chris Griffin's development as a character is another dimension of this. He has been presented across the show's run as an awkward, not particularly bright adolescent with an interest in art and a tendency to stumble into improbable situations. This characterization has been broadly consistent, but the specific flavor of his adolescence, the things he worries about, the social world he inhabits, the cultural references that shape his experience has evolved to reflect whatever decade the show is actually being made in, while his fundamental age has not changed. He is still 13. He has been 13 for 25 years. In that time, the world of 13-year-olds has transformed almost beyond recognition, and Chris has navigated each version of that world without anyone acknowledging the passage between them. Stewie's time machine creates additional temporal paradoxes that the show has also never fully resolved. The time machine has been used to visit the show's own past. The episode Back to the Pilot in Season 10 sends Brian and Stewie back to the first episode of Family Guy, where they interact with the 1,999 versions of the characters. This episode is charming and self-aware, but it creates an interesting problem. If the time machine can revisit the show's own history, and if that history is now more than 20 years deep, then the gap between the characters in the early episodes and the characters in the present-day episodes should be clearly visible. And it is, somewhat. The 999 animation is deliberately reproduced to mark the historical distance. But the characters themselves, the Peter and Lois and Meg and Chris of 1999, are not meaningfully older or younger than the characters of the present. Time has passed for the show, but not for the people in it, and the time machine visits make this visible in a way that the regular episodes can avoid. Section 10: Deaths, Resurrections, and Consequences that do not stick. There is a specific kind of story that Family Guy has returned to repeatedly across its run, and it is the story in which something significant happens, something that, in the logic of realistic storytelling, would have permanent consequences, and those consequences then fail to materialize in subsequent episodes. The death of Brian Griffin in Season 12 is the most dramatic example of this pattern, but it is also the most extensively discussed, so it is worth examining it within the broader context of the show's relationship with permanent change and its general preference for the reset. Brian's death occurs in the episode Life of Brian in Season 12. He is struck by a car while playing street hockey with Stewie. The death is presented with considerable emotional weight. The Griffin family mourns, Stewie is devastated, and a new dog named Vinny, voiced by Tony Sirico, is brought into the household. The show signals, through all of these elements, that this is a genuine change. Brian is dead. This is real. The response from the audience was significant. Brian's death made national news. Fans started petitions. The emotional investment people had made in the character over 12 seasons of television was genuinely affected by his removal from the show, even those who had been frustrated with Brian's increasingly difficult behavior in later seasons. People do not want the things they have grown attached to simply disappear. 2 episodes later, in the Christmas episode Christmas Guy, Stewie acquires a time machine, the device, from an earlier adventure and uses it to travel back in time to the moment before Brian is struck by the car. He prevents the accident. Brian lives. The timeline in which Brian died, the 2-episode stretch of family grief and canine replacement, is erased. As Brian reunites with Stewie, Stewie tells him simply, "The timeline in which you died no longer exists." Seth MacFarlane's subsequent tweet was famously blunt. He expressed, in colorful terms, that no one should have thought he was actually going to kill Brian permanently, that the death was always intended to be temporary. This is interesting in itself, the creator of the show, confirming after the fact that what was presented as a permanent change was always intended as a temporary emotional manipulation, a rating stunt dressed as a story decision. The pattern that surrounds Brian's death is characteristic of the show's broader relationship with permanence. Major changes happen. Characters are transformed, relationships are altered, status quos are shaken in ways that the episode frames as genuine and lasting. And then, by the next episode or the next season, the change has been absorbed, reversed, or simply forgotten, and things are roughly where they were before. Peter's white hair is an example already mentioned, established as permanent, and then quietly reversed with no explanation. But there are many others. In the 2-parter Stewie Kills Lois and Lois Kills Stewie, the show kills its own title character, Lois, and then reveals the entire thing was a simulation. The dramatic stakes of watching Lois die, which the episode builds carefully, are entirely negated by the reveal. You have watched something that did not happen. The show has done this repeatedly with other seemingly dramatic events. Characters have been revealed to have terminal illnesses, then recovered, or had the illness quietly forgotten. Characters have lost jobs, had their lives fundamentally altered, entered or exited relationships, and the reversal of each of these changes has been handled with varying levels of acknowledgement, from the straightforward reset that simply starts the next episode as if nothing happened to the narrative internal explanation that uses time travel or a dream sequence to explicitly erase the change. Adam West, the real actor Adam West, who voiced the fictional mayor Adam West of the town, died in real life in 2017. The show acknowledged his passing, and the character was written out. This is a case where real-world circumstances forced a genuine, permanent change that the show could not and did not reverse. Characters who cannot return to life because the actors who voiced them have died represent the show's most genuine relationship with permanent consequence. The handling of Francis Griffin's death is another example of a permanent change that the show genuinely honored. Peter's adoptive father, Francis, died in a Season 5 episode, and his death was allowed to stand. Francis does not return. He is occasionally referenced, sometimes visited as a spirit in Christmas episodes, but his death is not reversed. This is notable because it shows the show can commit to permanence when it chooses to. The contrast between how the show treats the deaths of major and minor characters is illuminating. Brian can die and come back because the audience reaction to his permanent death would be too large to absorb. Francis can die and stay dead because his absence, while meaningful, does not restructure the show's fundamental dynamic. The decision about which deaths are permanent and which are reversible is not driven by story logic, but by the practical calculus of fan attachment and show structure. Characters have also been killed in ways so casual and so quickly forgotten that the casual nature itself becomes the joke. Meg has been launched into space, apparently fatally, in cutaway gags and throwaway moments, and appeared in the following scene entirely unaffected. Stewie has experienced apparently lethal situations in dream sequences, simulations, and brief story detours that are entirely resolved before the episode ends. The show's relationship with death is one of theatrical casualness. Death can appear, create a momentary dramatic charge, and then be dissolved before it has time to settle. What this creates, over the full run of the show, is a kind of insurance policy against consequence. Events happen, but consequences are optional. Dramatic stakes are offered and then withdrawn. The audience learns, over time, that the show will not commit to the things it appears to commit to, that the change announced this week will likely be reversed or forgotten by the following week, that the only changes that stick are the ones the show cannot undo for practical reasons outside the story itself. Section 11: The Town That Cannot Decide What It Is. The fictional town of Quahog, Rhode Island, where Family Guy is set, is a place with its own substantial set of internal contradictions. Like the Griffin House, Quahog is less a consistent geographical entity and more a flexible narrative space that provides whatever the current story needs. But the contradictions of the town go beyond simple geography into the deeper question of what kind of place Quahog actually is and how it functions. Begin with the economics. Quahog is presented, in the broadest strokes, as a working-class New England town. Peter works at a brewery. His friends include a police officer, a pilot, and a deli owner. The neighborhood of Spooner Street appears to be solidly middle-income suburban, the kind of place where houses are modest and people are vaguely worried about money without being in any actual financial crisis. But Quahog also has the full institutional infrastructure of a major American city. It has television news stations, multiple of them. It has a large hospital that gets visited regularly. It has restaurants, bars, clubs, casinos, a theater district, and various other cultural amenities that are more consistent with a city of several 100,000 people than with a Rhode Island town. It has a functioning local government complete with a mayor whose position seems to carry significant executive power. It has a professional sports environment and a civic life that resembles, at various points across the show's run, Boston, Providence, and a large anonymous American metropolis. The population of Quahog is never quite clear. In some episodes, the town feels small characters run into each other with a frequency that suggests everyone in Quahog knows everyone else. In others, it is large enough for the characters to be genuinely anonymous, to visit places they have never been, to encounter strangers who are clearly locals with no connection to anyone in the regular cast. These two scales of community are very different from each other, and Quahog seems to occupy both simultaneously depending on what the episode requires. The mayor of Quahog for many seasons was Adam West, or rather, the character named Mayor Adam West, who was played by actor Adam West, doing a version of himself that referenced his fame as the actor who played Batman, while also being a genuinely eccentric mayor of a real fictional town. Mayor West's role in the show was delightfully inconsistent. In some episodes, he was a functioning public servant who engaged with genuine civic issues, albeit in idiosyncratic ways. In other episodes, he was more of a celebrity cameo playing a stranger in a strange land, disconnected from any genuine exercise of municipal power. His policies, when the show engaged with them directly, created their own continuity problems. The drinking age raised to 50, the same episode that creates the quagmire age problem discussed earlier, is presented as a real law with real enforcement in Quahog. The episode plays out the consequences of this law for Peter and his friends. But the law and its consequences do not persist into subsequent episodes. Quahog's drinking age returns to its normal level without any mention of a policy reversal, because the law existed only to serve the story of that one episode. The town's relationship with its own history is also elastic. Episodes set in Quahog's past, occasionally explored through flashback or time travel, do not always produce a coherent picture of how the town developed into what it is in the show's present. There are references to Quahog's history as a colonial settlement, its relationship with Rhode Island's actual history, its position within the regional culture of New England. But the specific details of the town's development do not add up into a consistent chronology. Quahog's television news infrastructure is worth noting specifically because it is a recurring setting. The show's news station, Quahog 5 News, is featured in many episodes, and the newscasters Tom Tucker and Diane Simmons, replaced eventually by other characters as the show's internal history demanded, are recurring presences. But the institutional life of the news station changes significantly depending on what story the show is telling. Its resources, its reach, its relationship with the community it serves, these are calibrated episode by episode rather than held to a consistent standard. The Drunken Clam, the bar where Peter and his friends spend a significant portion of their time, is another example of a setting that exists somewhat outside the consistent logic of the town's geography. The bar's interior layout has changed across seasons. Its relationship to Spooner Street, how far it is, how the characters get there, has been inconsistent. The bar occasionally has events and regular patrons who suggest a wider community than the regular characters, but that wider community appears and disappears based on what the current episode needs. What is most interesting about Quahog as a place is how it reflects the show's overall philosophy about setting. The town is not a character in the way that Springfield is arguably a character in The Simpsons. It is a backdrop, a named, loosely defined backdrop that provides the context for the characters' stories without having its own consistent internal logic. It has enough specific detail to feel grounded, the specific Rhode Island references, the regional New England flavor, the recurring locations, but not enough systematic consistency to function as a real place you could map or navigate. This is fine, for the most part. Most long-running sitcoms treat their settings with this kind of loose specificity, enough detail to feel real, not enough to be real. But Family Guy's version of this approach is particularly visible because the show has run for so long and has generated so many episodes that the inconsistencies have accumulated into something substantial. The town that cannot quite decide how large it is, or where its institutions are, or what its laws are in any given episode, becomes over 400 episodes, a place with a genuinely bewildering internal geography. Section 12. The Lois Griffin Contradiction. Lois Griffin is, in certain respects, the most stable major character in Family Guy. While Peter's personality has shifted dramatically across the show's run, while Brian has transformed from voice of reason to objective audience frustration, while Stewie has evolved from villain to something more ambiguous, Lois has maintained a fairly consistent function in the show's ecosystem. She is the capable, occasionally exasperated wife who manages the consequences of Peter's behavior while having her own off-center qualities that prevent her from being simply the straight man in Peter's comedy. But Lois has her own substantial set of contradictions, and they are worth examining because they reveal something interesting about how the show has conceptualized the character of the rich girl who married working class. The foundational fact of Lois's background is that she is wealthy, not comfortably middle-class wealthy, genuinely, generationally wealthy. Her father, Carter Pewterschmidt, is presented as a billionaire. He owns Pewterschmidt Industries, which appears to be a significant industrial conglomerate. He lives in a mansion. He has the political connections and social standing of the American ultra-rich. Lois grew up in this world, was educated within it, and chose to step away from it when she married Peter over her father's strenuous objections. This origin is established clearly in the early seasons and referred to throughout the show's run. Carter Pewterschmidt has appeared in many episodes. His wealth, his dismissal of Peter, his complex relationship with his daughter, these are recurring story elements that have generated some of the show's best secondary plots. But Lois's accent is, by any reasonable standard, not the accent of a wealthy Rhode Island family. She speaks with what can only be described as a thick New England working-class accent, the same regional flavor as Peter, despite having grown up in an entirely different social world. Her mother Barbara speaks with the clipped, cultivated accent one would associate with old money and East Coast establishment culture. Lois's brother and sister, when they appear, do not share Lois's accent either. The accent is Lois-specific, and its presence in a character who grew up in a world of wealth and private education is, as the show itself has acknowledged through character comments, puzzling. The show has never explained where Lois's working-class New England accent came from. It is one of those details that was established in the pilot when the character was being designed and was never revisited with any attempt at consistency with the later development of her backstory. The accent is so familiar, so associated with Lois as a character, that it has become simply part of who she is, but it represents a genuine inconsistency with the established facts of her upbringing. Lois's talent for music is established early in the show. She is a piano teacher. This is part of her professional identity in the first seasons, and then largely allowed to recede into the background. Episodes that need to invoke her musical ability do so. Episodes that do not need this fact of her character simply proceed without it. This is not a contradiction exactly, but it is an inconsistency in how fully the show draws on her established skill set. Her relationship with her own identity is perhaps the most interesting contradiction of all. Lois is presented in the early seasons as a woman who made a choice, who voluntarily stepped away from wealth and social standing to build a simpler, more authentic life with a man her family did not approve of. This is the romantic backstory of the character. It gives her choices and her tolerance of Peter's behavior a certain coherence. She chose this life. She values what it represents even when it is difficult. But the show's handling of Lois in later seasons has complicated this self-conception considerably. There are episodes that suggest Lois is not entirely at peace with the life she chose, that there is a version of her that misses the world she grew up in, that resents the limits of her current circumstances, that sometimes wonders what her life would have been if she had married someone her father approved of. These episodes are interesting and add dimension to the character, but they exist in tension with the episodes that present Lois as fully committed to and satisfied with the life she has built. There are also episodes in which Lois reveals qualities and skills that are inconsistent with each other in ways that reflect the show's tendency to draw from whatever aspect of a character's past will serve the current story. She has been revealed to have a criminal history, to have engaged in behavior during her youth that contradicts her present-day presentation as a responsible, community-minded mother. Some of these revelations are played as genuine character depth. Others are played purely for comedic effect and are then forgotten. The aggregate picture of Lois Griffin's past is, like Peter's, a collection of episode-specific details that do not assemble into a fully coherent biography. Her management of the household's finances is inconsistent in a way that mirrors the show's broader economic inconsistencies. In some episodes, the Griffin family's financial situation is a source of genuine stress. They cannot afford things. Peter's job loss creates real hardship. The gap between their income and their lifestyle is a problem the story takes seriously. In other episodes, the family has access to resources, vacations, home improvements, experiences that are inconsistent with the financial position that other episodes have established. The gap between these two modes of the family's economic life reflects the show's willingness to adjust the family's financial circumstances to whatever the current episode requires. Lois's relationship with her own mother and father has shifted in interesting ways across the show's run. In the early seasons, Carter Pewterschmidt is a consistent antagonist, cruel, dismissive of Peter, unwilling to accept his daughter's life choices. Over time, the relationship between Peter and Carter has evolved into something more complicated, with moments of genuine connection alongside the fundamental antagonism. This evolution is relatively well handled, but the specific details of Carter's character, his history, his business dealings, his political affiliations have drifted in ways that reflect the same episodic inconsistency that affects the other characters. What Lois represents, ultimately, is an example of a character who is stable enough in her core function and personality that her specific inconsistencies are less visible than those of characters who have undergone more dramatic transformation. She is the capable one. She is the voice of reason. She is the person who makes the family function despite Peter's behavior. These broad strokes are consistent. It is in the details, the accent, the finances, the backstory, the specific history that the inconsistencies accumulate into something worth noting. Section 13: Money, Jobs, and the Economics of the Impossible. One of the most consistently inconsistent aspects of Family Guy is the economic world that the Griffin family inhabits. This deserves its own section because it touches on nearly every major character, and because it reflects something genuine and interesting about the show's relationship with the material conditions of its characters' lives. Peter Griffin works at the Pawtucket Brewery. This is his primary occupation for the majority of the show's run. following his earlier employment at the Happy-Go-Lucky Toy Factory in the first 3 seasons and a brief stint as a fisherman during the transitional period. The brewery job is relatively stable. He has been fired and rehired multiple times, but the institution of his employment there has been one of the show's most consistent recurring facts. The problem is that the life Peter and his family lead does not consistently reflect the income of a brewery shipping clerk in a mid-sized New England town. The Griffin House itself, a 2-story home on Spooner Street, represents a level of real estate that would, in Rhode Island, require an income comfortably above what Peter's brewery position would be expected to provide. The family takes vacations, attends significant events, participates in experiences and purchases that are inconsistent with their established financial position. The show has addressed this directly in some episodes, treating financial hardship as a real condition with real consequences. There are stories where Peter losing his job creates genuine household stress, where Lois has to find work, where the family's finances become a plot driver. These episodes engage with the economic reality of the Griffins' situation earnestly enough to suggest the writers take the financial dimension of their lives seriously. But other episodes in the same seasons, sometimes episodes that come directly before or after the ones treating finances seriously, present the Griffins with resources and access that simply do not fit the established economic picture. They are sometimes rich enough to afford things that their income should preclude, and sometimes poor enough for that poverty to be dramatically meaningful. And these two states can coexist within the same season without any explanation for why the family's financial situation has apparently changed. The Pewterschmidt wealth complicates this further. Lois's parents are billionaires. This is established, repeated, and used as a story element across the entire run of the show. Carter Pewterschmidt's money is invoked in episodes where the family needs resources directly, as in episodes where Carter is asked for help or where access to his mansion becomes story relevant. But the relationship between Lois's family wealth and the Griffin family's day-to-day economic situation is never fully articulated. Why does the daughter of a billionaire live in a house that creates financial stress for her family? Has Carter cut Lois off entirely? Is there some ongoing financial arrangement that occasionally provides access to resources? The show implies different answers in different episodes. Chris's economic contribution to the family, or lack of it, is a minor but telling detail. He is, in the show's present, a teenager. He has various interests and various episodes in which his character takes center stage. He has had part-time jobs in individual episodes, but his status as an economic actor within the household is vague and changes based on what the story needs. The question of how the Griffin family purchased their house in the first place is addressed interestingly in a piece of continuity that is actually relatively consistent across the show's run. The money that funded the purchase of the Spooner Street house came from a lawsuit settlement. Lois became pregnant with Chris due to a broken condom, and the resulting lawsuit against the manufacturer provided the down payment. This is a specific and somewhat surprising piece of established backstory that the show has referenced multiple times, and it is more consistent than many other financial details in the Griffin family history. Stewie's economic relationship with the world is its own category of impossibility. His laboratory equipment, his time machine, his various advanced technological devices, the cost of manufacturing and operating these things would be astronomical in the real world, and the show has never even gestured toward where the funding for Stewie's projects comes from. He is a 1-year-old. He does not have income. His parents are not funding his weapons research. The technology in his nursery exists because the character exists, and the character exists in a world where the normal questions about resources and cost do not apply to a baby genius's laboratory. Brian's finances are similarly curious. He drinks martinis, drives a car, this is established in early seasons though later inconsistently applied, and has the lifestyle of a moderately successful middle-class adult. His writing has occasionally produced income. The self-help book in Season 9 was apparently very successful, but most of his writing has been unpublished or unsuccessful. He lives with the Griffin family and presumably does not pay rent. His economic situation is the kind of vague middle ground that allows the character to participate in adult economic life without the show having to account for how he actually funds that participation. Peter's various side ventures across the show's run are worth cataloging briefly because they represent a recurring pattern. Peter has, at various points across the series, started businesses, pursued new careers, taken on temporary jobs, discovered new callings, and entered professional roles only for each of these to vanish by the start of the next episode or the next season, with no acknowledgement that they ever happened. A partial list would include journalism, farming, professional wrestling, politics, entertainment, food service, activism, and several others that appeared in single episodes and left no trace on the subsequent narrative. These episodic careers serve the show's structure. Each one provides the premise for a new story, but they create an economic history for Peter that is bewilderingly incoherent if you try to assemble it into a career. Timeline. The man at the brewery is also the man who has tried and failed at dozens of other professional avenues, none of which appear to have left any financial scar or any professional reputation that follows him into subsequent stories. The family's wealth and poverty oscillate in a rhythm that mirrors the oscillation of their house's architecture, both expanding and contracting, according to narrative need rather than according to any consistent economic logic. This is perhaps the show's most fundamental inconsistency, because money underlies almost everything in the characters' lives: their house, their opportunities, their choices, their relationships. A show that cannot decide how much money its characters have is, in some sense, a show that cannot quite decide what kind of world it lives in. And yet, here is the thing. This inconsistency, like all the others we have visited tonight, does not prevent the show from being what it is. Family Guy has never been primarily about the economic texture of its characters' lives. It has been about the comedy of specific situations, the chemistry of specific character dynamics, the rhythm of jokes delivered in a specific voice that millions of people have come to love. The finances are a backdrop, as the house is a backdrop, as the town is a backdrop. The details of these backgrounds are inconsistent, but the foreground, the characters themselves, the humor, the warmth that the early seasons established and that persists in diminished form into the later ones, is stable enough to carry the show across all of the inconsistencies that accumulate beneath it. The plot holes of Family Guy are not cracks in the foundation. They are features of a building that was constructed without a blueprint, room by room, season by season, by dozens of different builders who each brought their own version of the structure to the work. What they built is imperfect and inconsistent and genuinely wonderful. It has stood for 25 years. It will continue to stand, reshaped by every season, every episode, every writer who adds a room where none existed before and closes a door that was supposed to stay open. Section 14. The gentle conclusion at the end of the night. There is a particular quality to the experience of knowing a story's gaps. It is not frustration, at least not always. It is something closer to intimacy, the feeling of knowing a place well enough to notice where the walls do not quite meet, where the floor creaks in ways the original builders probably did not plan, where a window that should look out onto one view actually looks out onto another. Family Guy has given us 25 years of walls that do not quite meet. The house on Spooner Street cannot decide how many rooms it has. Peter Griffin cannot quite decide how old he is or which version of his past is the true one. Brian came to the Griffins as an adult stray and also as a puppy captured on home video, and he has a son who is biologically impossible and fully human nonetheless. Stewie can be heard by everyone and by no one, and the rules about which of those is currently operating depend entirely on what the episode needs. Quagmire is 61, except when he is not, and has a head of hair that is real and also a wig, depending on which episode you last watched. Meg's father is Stan Thompson, except when it is Peter, and she has spent 25 years not quite knowing who she is, while the show cannot quite agree either. Bonnie Swanson was pregnant for 7 years of broadcast time. The town of Quahog is simultaneously a small New England town where everyone knows everyone and a large American city with multiple news stations and a functioning municipal government. The Griffins are sometimes poor, and sometimes comfortable, and sometimes inexplicably wealthy, and the transitions between these states are never quite explained. All of this is true, and all of it is also, in its own way, irrelevant to the experience of actually watching the show, because the show is not at its best about the consistency of its own world. It is about the comedy of specific moments, the warmth of specific relationships, the way a particular voice delivers a particular line in a way that makes you laugh even though you saw it coming. These things are not diminished by the plot holes that surround them. If anything, the holes are evidence of how much the show has produced, that 25 years of storytelling has accumulated enough material that the inconsistencies have become their own kind of landscape, a terrain worth exploring for its own sake. The gaps are not failures. They are the record of a very long conversation that has been happening, on and off, since the 31st of January 1999, a conversation in which hundreds of people have participated, in writing rooms and animation studios and recording booths, each contributing their piece to a story that was never quite finished, and was never quite supposed to be. The house on Spooner Street stands. It will continue to stand. Rooms appearing and disappearing, the basement entrance migrating from kitchen to hallway to somewhere less specific, the garage materialized and dematerialized by the needs of each passing episode. The family inside it will continue to be whatever age they have always been, which is to say roughly the same age they were at the beginning, give or take a decade that nobody is counting too carefully. And Brian will continue to be a dog and a writer and a father to a human son and a stray Peter found by the side of the road and a puppy who was somehow filmed by the family he had not yet met. All of these things at once. All of these contradictions held together by a white coat and a martini and a voice that has been part of the show since the very first day. Good night. Sleep well. The lights are out on Spooner Street. If you made it this far, thank you for spending this time with this story. If this is the kind of content that helps you drift off or wind down, a like on this video and a subscription to the channel would make an enormous difference, and it is completely free. Drop a comment below if you are still awake, and let us know what you would like to visit next. There are more gaps out there. There always are. Script for Uncle Guy lore fall asleep to the biggest plot holes in Family Guy. Expanded section, the rules of the drunken clam and why they never quite hold. If the Griffin House is the primary physical contradiction of Family Guy, the building that cannot make up its mind about how many rooms it has or where they are, then the drunken clam, the bar where Peter and his friends spend a significant and apparently unlimited portion of their waking hours, is the secondary contradiction, a space whose relationship to itself has been as flexible as the house's and whose institutional identity has shifted across the show's run in ways that are worth sitting with for a moment. The bar is established from the very beginning. In the earliest episodes, the Drunken Clam is a neighborhood institution, the kind of place that exists in every working-class American community, worn at the edges, comfortable in its shabbiness, populated by the same handful of regulars who have been sitting at the same tables for decades. The bar serves the function that bars serve in this kind of community. It is the place where men who have nowhere else to be go to be nowhere together, to drink, to talk, to avoid going home to whatever is waiting for them there. Peter, Cleveland, Quagmire, and Joe are these men, and the Drunken Clam is their place. The interior of the bar has been drawn and redrawn across 25 seasons by many different animators working from many different reference sheets, and the accumulated inconsistencies are considerable. The bar counter's position relative to the entrance has shifted. The number and arrangement of tables in the main seating area has varied. The specific decor, the maritime theme, the neon signs, the general atmosphere of a place that has not been renovated since sometime in the 1980s is broadly consistent, but the specific details within that consistency are fluid. The bathroom, when it appears, has been in different locations relative to the rest of the space. The back room, when it exists, has existed in different configurations. None of this is particularly remarkable in isolation. Any bar depicted across 25 years and 400 episodes of television will accumulate this kind of visual inconsistency. What is more interesting is the bar's institutional identity, what kind of establishment the Drunken Clam actually is, and what its relationship to the community it serves looks like. In some episodes, the bar is genuinely the humble neighborhood place it appears to be a low-margin operation run by a single proprietor, patronized by the same small group of regulars, barely solvent enough to keep the lights on. In other episodes, the bar has hosted events, entertainment acts, and gatherings that imply a scale of operation well beyond what the humble neighborhood establishment premise would support. The bar has also changed ownership and management across the show's run in ways that were sometimes acknowledged and sometimes simply occurred between episodes without comment. The original proprietor, Horace, died in a later season and the bar passed to other hands. This transition was handled with some care when it occurred, but the ongoing management of the bar in subsequent episodes has not always been entirely consistent about who is in charge of the establishment and under what circumstances. The regulars at the bar, the people who are not part of the main cast, but who populate the background of Drunken Clam scenes, have appeared and disappeared with the same casual disregard for continuity that the show applies to most of its secondary and tertiary characters. People who are shown as established regulars in one season do not appear in the next. New background characters establish themselves as if they have always been there. The social ecology of the bar is fluid in the way that all background social ecologies are fluid in long-running television, populated episode by episode based on who the scene needs rather than based on any consistent picture of who actually drinks at this bar. The distances between the Griffin House and the Drunken Clam are another example of the show's flexible geography. In some episodes, the bar appears to be within walking distance of Spooner Street. Characters move between the two locations with the ease of a short stroll, and the neighborhood relationship between the house and the bar is immediate and proximate. In other episodes, getting to the bar seems to require driving, or involves a distance that implies a neighborhood relationship more removed than the casual proximity of certain other episodes. These are not large inconsistencies, and they are produced by the same flexible geography that affects all of Quahog. But they contribute to the overall sense of the town as a place that arranges itself around the story rather than maintaining a fixed physical logic of its own. Expanded section: The Peter and Brian friendship and what it has forgotten. One of the most important things Family Guy established in its earliest seasons is the friendship between Peter and Brian, a relationship that was, in those first 3 seasons, the emotional core of the show in a way that no other relationship quite matched. Peter was the lovable fool. Brian was the voice of reason. Their friendship was the classic comedy pairing, the man of limited intelligence and expansive feeling, and the man of considerable intelligence and limited warmth, drawn together in ways that served both of them, even when it frustrated both of them. This friendship has generated its own considerable set of inconsistencies across the show's run, and those inconsistencies are worth examining because they reflect something true about what happened to the show's emotional priorities as it moved from the early seasons into the later ones. In the first 3 seasons, the Peter-Brian dynamic is consistent and carefully maintained. Peter loves Brian the way you love a friend who is also a project who you feel responsible for, who you want to see succeed, whose failures pain you in ways you would not be able to fully explain. Brian loves Peter the way you love a friend who is also, in certain lights, a child who you are sometimes exasperated by, who you genuinely wish was better than he is, but who you would not trade for someone easier or smarter or more convenient. They are genuinely close. Their closeness is evident in how they treat each other in moments of stress, in how they handle each other's failures, in the rhythm of their dialogue when nothing in particular is at stake. By the later seasons, this friendship has evolved into something both more and less than what it was. More in the sense that Brian and Stewie's friendship has become the show's primary bromance, a more dramatically fertile relationship, more capable of genuine emotional depth, more willing to explore the complicated feelings that genuine friendship can generate. Less, in the sense that the Peter-Brian friendship has become more episodic and less consistently warm. There are episodes where they are close in the old way, and episodes where they are strangers in the same household. And the transition between these states is not always driven by anything that happened in the intervening story. The specific knowledge that Brian has of Peter and that Peter has of Brian is one of the more interesting dimensions of this consistency problem. In Screwed the Pooch, the episode that establishes Meg's real father as Stan Thompson, Brian's ability to answer questions about the Griffin family is presented as evidence of how deeply embedded he is in the family's inner life. He knows things that even Peter does not know. He knows the family's secrets. He is, functionally, not just a pet but a genuine confidant and intimate of the household. But in later episodes, Peter and Brian relate to each other in ways that do not always reflect this depth of mutual knowledge. Peter has expressed surprise about facts of Brian's history that, given the closeness of their early relationship, should be well-established knowledge between them. Brian has been surprised by things about Peter that, given the same closeness, should not require discovery. The intimacy that the early seasons carefully established has eroded, not through any story development that explains the erosion, but through the cumulative effect of 2 decades of episodic storytelling, in which the closeness between these two characters is invoked when useful, and not invoked when something else is required. There is also the matter of what Brian has and has not told Peter across the show's run. Various revelations about Brian's life, his son Dylan, his various romantic histories, the complicated relationship with his own biological family are presented in episodes as new information that Peter is receiving for the first time. Given that Brian has been living with the Griffin family for the entirety of the show's run, And given the closeness of their friendship as established in those early seasons, the question of how so much significant biographical information about Brian has gone unmentioned for so long is one that the show has never satisfactorily answered. The episodes treat each revelation as new because the story requires it to be new. The long history of intimacy between these two characters would suggest it should not be new. This tension is one of the more persistent background inconsistencies in the show's treatment of its central relationships. Expanded section. The physics problem. What Family Guy does to bodies. There is a specific category of Family Guy plot hole that does not involve character, biography, or house architecture, or financial inconsistency, but instead involves the basic physics of the world. The show depicts specifically the same question of what kind of physical damage is possible, recoverable from, and depicted with what degree of realism across different episodes and different seasons. In the early seasons, Family Guy's physical comedy operated within the conventions of standard animated violence. Characters got hurt, they fell from heights, collided with objects, were struck by things that should have been damaging. And then they were fine. This is the cartoon convention, the same logic that allows a Warner Brothers character to run off a cliff and hang in the air for a moment before falling, or a Hanna-Barbera character to be flattened by an anvil and reappear round and vertical in the following scene. The audience understands and accepts this convention because it is part of the language of animation, and the convention allows physical comedy to exist without the weight of realistic consequences. The early Family Guy honored this convention relatively consistently. The physical humor was exaggerated, impossible, and consequence-free in the way that cartoon physics is consequence-free. Characters survived things that would not be survived in the real world, and this was not presented as remarkable, it was simply the way the world of the show worked. The show's relationship with physical damage changed across the later seasons in a way that has been noted by critics and fans. The violence became more graphic, more detailed, more committed to depicting the specific physical reality of serious injury in ways that the early seasons cartoon convention did not invite. Injuries were shown with a degree of visual specificity that went beyond standard animated exaggeration and approached something more unsettling. The gap between the slapstick register of the early seasons and the more disturbing register of some later seasons' physical content is one of the more frequently cited differences between what the show was and what it became. But within any given season, the inconsistency involves which injuries have lasting effects and which do not. Peter has been shot in various episodes and recovered immediately or recovered eventually or suffered apparently no lasting consequence. He has been severely injured and appeared fully healthy in the following scene. He has also, in other episodes, had injuries that were treated with a degree of seriousness and consequence that implied the show intended them to have lasting effects, effects that then did not materialize in subsequent episodes. Stewie's relationship with death-proximate events has already been discussed in the context of the simulation and dream conventions. But the broader question of which physical events in the show have weight and which do not is one that the show has never answered consistently. A character's injury matters when the story needs it to matter. It does not matter when the story needs the character to be healthy in the following scene. This is again a feature rather than a bug. The show is making a choice, season by season, about when the physical world it depicts will have the logic of the real world and when it will have the logic of cartoons. The inconsistency arises from the show making this choice differently in different episodes without establishing a clear rule about which mode applies when. The chicken fights Peter's recurring battles with the giant chicken who appears periodically across the show's run to engage in extended, physics-defying, property-destroying combat sequences are a specific illustration of this problem. Each chicken fight is spectacular, elaborately animated, and completely immune to any realistic assessment of the physical damage involved. Both participants survive things that would be fatal dozens of times over. The environments through which they fight are destroyed on a scale that would be catastrophic in any real-world context. And then the fight ends and both participants go their separate ways and the world continues as if the battle did not happen. The chicken fights are a clear case where the show is explicitly operating in the cartoon register, where the exaggeration is the point, where no one is supposed to be applying realistic standards to what is occurring. But they exist in the same world as episodes that treat other kinds of physical damage with considerably more seriousness, and the difference between what the chicken fights do to the world and what that damage means versus what other physical events do and mean is a question the show has never addressed. Expanded section. the question of memory and what these characters know about each other. There is a pattern in Family Guy that is less about the facts of the characters' histories and more about the question of what they know about each other, what they have told each other, what they remember, what they seem to have collectively forgotten about things that were apparently established between them in previous episodes. Memory, in long-running television, is always somewhat selective. Characters in episodic television do not carry the full weight of their shared history into every scene the way real people do. Convenience drives what is remembered and what is allowed to lapse, and the audience generally extends the grace of not requiring characters to explicitly reference everything that has happened between them before proceeding with the current scene. This is part of how episodic television functions, and resisting this convention would produce dialogue that consisted almost entirely of recapping past events. But Family Guy has a specific relationship with character memory that goes beyond the ordinary selective amnesia of episodic television. The show has established significant facts about its characters, about what they know, about what they have experienced together, about the depth and nature of their relationships, and then proceeded to have those characters interact in ways that cannot be reconciled with what has been established. The handling of secrets is a particularly clear example. The show establishes that certain characters know certain things that other characters do not. Meg's biological parentage is one example. Brian knows that her real father is Stan Thompson. Peter knows this, but Meg does not. This differential knowledge is established clearly. It should affect how the knowing characters interact with Meg, and with each other there is a specific kind of responsibility and awkwardness that comes with knowing something about someone that they do not know about themselves. But the show does not consistently honor this dynamic. Episodes proceed with Brian and Peter interacting with Meg without the specific texture that knowing this particular secret about her should give to those interactions. The same pattern applies to various other pieces of differential knowledge that the show has established across its run. Characters know things that they then appear to not know, or forget to demonstrate that they know, or behave in ways that make sense only if they do not know something that the show has established they do know. This is not always a failure. Sometimes the inconsistency is small enough that it does not significantly affect the story being told. But across the accumulated weight of 25 seasons, the pattern of characters forgetting what they know about each other creates a world in which the relationships between people are less stable and less coherent than the individual moments of connection between them would suggest. The friendship groups in the show are particularly affected by this. Peter, Cleveland, Joe, and Quagmire are established as close friends who have known each other for years and whose friendship has the depth that comes from shared experience and genuine affection. But specific facts about each other's lives that they should know, that should be part of the background of their shared history, are occasionally treated as new information in episodes where the story needs those facts to be discovered rather than known. The friends sometimes discover things about each other that, given the closeness of their friendship and the duration of their acquaintance, should not require discovery at all. This is the most human of the show's inconsistencies, in a way. Real friendships also have gaps in knowledge. People tell each other different amounts about different things, and even close friends can surprise each other with revelations that seem like they should have come up before. But the gaps in Family Guy's friendships are not the organic gaps of real human relationships. They are the gaps produced by episodic storytelling, where each episode draws from the characters' established relationships in whatever way the current story requires, without the obligation to account for everything that the previous stories established about what these people know about each other. Expanded section: the television shows. Within the television show, Family Guy has, across its run, established that certain television programs exist within its fictional world: news programs, children's shows, entertainment programming that the characters watch or participate in. The specific details of these fictional programs and their relationship to each other and to the broader world of the show have generated their own small set of inconsistencies that are worth noting. The most consistently present fictional media institution in the show is Quahog 5 News, the local television news operation that employs Tom Tucker and a rotating cast of supporting journalists. Tom Tucker is one of the show's most reliable secondary characters, an anchor of the old school, pompous, and self-serious in ways that the show finds consistently amusing, present across almost the entire run of the series. But the institutional details of Quahog 5 News shift considerably depending on what story the show is telling about the news. In some episodes, it is a genuinely functioning local news organization with the resources and infrastructure appropriate to the market it serves. In other episodes, it is depicted with a level of casualness and low-budget functionality that implies a considerably smaller and less professional operation. Tom Tucker's relationship to his own colleagues, his authority within the institution, and the institution's relationship to the broader media landscape of the fictional Rhode Island. The show depicts all of these things vary in ways that reflect the story's needs, rather than any consistent picture of the news organization. The children's television programming that appears within the show has similarly variable properties. In episodes where characters appear on or reference children's shows, where Stewie or Chris or other characters interact with fictional children's television, the specific properties of these programs change based on the joke rather than based on any consistent internal logic about how children's television works in this world. What is perhaps most interesting about the fictional media within the show is the way it has been used to reference the show's own real-world context, the way Family Guy has, across its run, used fictional media within the story to comment on its own situation as a real piece of media. Episodes that engage with the news media have used the fictional news context to make observations about actual media culture. Episodes involving fictional entertainment programs have drawn on the conventions and economics of actual entertainment programs, including Family Guy itself. This self-referential quality is one of the show's most consistent tendencies, and it has produced some of its most genuinely clever moments. But it also creates continuity problems, because the show's self-referential moments require the fictional world to have a specific relationship to the real world that subsequent episodes do not always honor. When the show breaks the fourth wall to acknowledge that its characters are aware they are on a television show, this awareness should carry some implications for how those characters understand and navigate their world in subsequent episodes. The show does not follow these implications consistently, because doing so would be self-limiting in ways that would affect the show's flexibility. The fourth wall breaks happen, and then the fourth wall is restored, and the characters proceed in their subsequent episodes as if the awareness of their own fictional status has lapsed back into unawareness. Expanded section: What the show knows about itself. Family Guy has, across its run, become increasingly self-aware in a specific and interesting way. The show knows it has been running for a long time. The show knows that its characters have aged very little in that time. The show knows that its storytelling is inconsistent. The show knows that its quality has varied. And it has, across many seasons, chosen to acknowledge these things directly through jokes that reference the show's own duration, through character dialogue that admits certain things do not add up, through fourth wall breaks that put the characters in direct conversation with the fact of their own fictional status. This self-awareness is, in certain episodes, quite sophisticated. The episode Back to the Pilot, which revisits the show's own history through a time travel frame, is genuinely thoughtful about what it means for a show to have a history about the relationship between who the characters were at the beginning and who they have become, across 2 decades of storytelling. The self-referential moments in that episode are not just jokes about the show's inconsistencies, but genuine reflections on the nature of long-running episodic television as a creative form. But the show's self-awareness also creates its own kind of problem, which is that acknowledging an inconsistency is not the same as resolving it, and making a joke about a continuity error does not make the continuity error no longer an error. When the show winks at the audience about its own plot holes, it is offering a kind of social contract. I know this does not make sense, and you know this does not make sense, and we are agreeing together to find the knowing about it more charming than the inconsistency is frustrating. This is a reasonable social contract, and it works reasonably well across the 25 years the show has been operating under it. The audience has accepted the inconsistencies as features rather than bugs, as evidence of the show's playful relationship with its own mythology rather than as failures of craft. The show knows its house cannot quite decide how many rooms it has, and the show has chosen to treat this as a source of comedy rather than as a problem to be solved. But there is something that sits slightly uneasily in the arrangement when you look at it carefully. The show's self-awareness about its own inconsistencies is selective in the same way that the inconsistencies themselves are selective. The show acknowledges the ones it finds funny to acknowledge, and ignores the ones it finds inconvenient to acknowledge. It chooses which gaps to wink at and which to simply leave alone. This is fine as a creative approach, The writer's selective attention to their own work is not a moral failing, but it means the self-awareness is performative rather than thoroughgoing. The show is not genuinely reckoning with its own inconsistencies. It is gesturing at them when it suits the joke and proceeding as if they do not exist when they do not. This is perhaps the most honest thing you can say about Family Guy as a creative enterprise. It is a show that has always known exactly what it was doing, and what it was doing has always been exactly what it wanted to do. And the consequences of doing that thing across 25 years and 400 episodes have produced a fictional world that is familiar and beloved and internally incoherent, and somehow, inexplicably, still standing. The house stands, the neighborhood is quiet. The characters are doing, somewhere off-screen, whatever they always do when nobody is watching, being the age they have always been. Living in the house that has always existed, remembering the things they remember and forgetting the things they forget. In the town that is and is not a small New England community, in the state that is and is not Rhode Island, in the America that is and is not the America visible through the bay window of the Griffin living room on any given evening. It is late. The inconsistencies have been aired. The rooms have been counted and found wanting. The ages have been noted and found impossible. The pregnancies and the deaths and the resurrections and the hair colors and the biological impossibilities have all been given their due. Sleep Now, expanded section. The secondary characters, nobody remembers consistently. Beyond the central cast, Family Guy has accumulated across its run a large population of recurring secondary characters whose appearances, histories, and specific biographical details have been handled with a degree of inconsistency that mirrors, in miniature, the inconsistencies of the main cast. Herbert is perhaps the most talked about example, a character whose entire premise involves behavior that, in a realistic setting, would require intervention from other characters who are presented as, at least nominally, aware of their responsibilities to each other's children. Herbert is the old man who lives nearby on Spooner Street. His interest in young males, particularly Chris, is a recurring joke that the show has maintained across many seasons. The nature of his interest is not subtle or ambiguous. It is, within the logic of the show, one of those things that everyone knows and nobody does anything about because the show's world has a different relationship to this kind of character than the real world does. Stewie actually addresses this directly in one episode. There is a moment where Stewie acknowledges, in direct dialogue, that there is a person of concerning interests living in the neighborhood and that nobody does anything about him because he is funny. This is the show's self-aware acknowledgement of Herbert's existence and the show's own refusal to do anything about him beyond the joke. The acknowledgement is clever. It does not resolve the underlying inconsistency, which is that Peter and Lois, who are, despite their many failings, presented as having some degree of care for their children, have been shown to be aware of Herbert's nature and have done nothing to address the situation across the entirety of the show's run. Adam West, the real actor who voiced Mayor Adam West for most of the show's run, created his own category of character inconsistency simply by being a real person playing a fictional version of himself. The character shared the real actor's name and profession and general public persona, but was not the real Adam West, was instead a version of Adam West filtered through the show's comedic sensibility, made into a slightly eccentric minor authority figure. When Adam West died in 2017, the show had to navigate the loss of an actor who was irreplaceable in a specific way. The joke of a real person playing a fictional version of himself could not survive the recasting of that role. The show handled West's death with genuine feeling, retiring the character, but the specific nature of Mayor West's character, simultaneously a real person and a fictional character based on that person, had always created a peculiar category of continuity. The mayor's history, his institutional relationships, the specific details of his governance of Quahog, these were all properties of a character who was also always pointing back toward the real actor playing him, and the joke depended on that pointing. The character could not be fully fictionally developed without undermining the joke that was his reason for existing. Mort Goldman, the pharmacist who operates a pharmacy in Quahog and who is one of the show's recurring secondary presences, is another character whose specific biographical details and institutional life have been handled with the show's characteristic flexibility. His pharmacy appears in different configurations in different episodes. His family relationships, particularly his relationship with his son Neil, who has a long-running and never requited interest in Meg, have been developed episodically rather than continuously, with specific facts about the family appearing when useful and not appearing when not. The recurring minor characters of the show, the news anchor Tom Tucker, the various colleagues and neighbors, and institutional representatives who populate the background of Quahog's social life, all exist in this same mode, recognizable in their broad strokes, variable in their specific details, present when the story needs them and absent when it does not, with no consistent accounting for where they are or what they are doing in the episodes where they do not appear. This is the nature of a supporting cast in a long-running comedy. The show cannot be about everyone all the time, and the people who are not the focus of a given episode simply exist off-screen in whatever state is most convenient for their next appearance. But across 25 years, the accumulation of these small inconsistencies in how secondary characters are treated creates a social world that is rich and familiar and also, when examined carefully, built on sand. Expanded section: the show's relationship with the real world and why it creates problems. Family Guy is unusual among animated comedies in the degree to which it has engaged directly with real-world events, real public figures, and real cultural moments across its run. The show has referenced and engaged with political events, social movements, technological changes, and cultural shifts in ways that go considerably beyond the usual animated comedy's casual acknowledgement of the world outside the show. This engagement has been one of the show's most distinctive qualities. Episodes have been built around specific political figures, specific legislative events, specific moments in American public life. Characters have had opinions about real things and expressed those opinions in ways that were clearly tied to specific moments in time. The show has broken from its fictional world frequently enough and explicitly enough to establish an ongoing relationship with the real world that most animated comedies maintain at a greater distance. But this engagement creates a specific kind of inconsistency when combined with the floating time convention. The characters exist outside of time, aging little across 25 years. The world they live in, when the show chooses to engage with it directly, is always the current world, the world of the year the episode was broadcast. The gap between these two facts produces stories that are often funny and socially specific at the time of their broadcast, but that date in particular, ways that create retroactive inconsistencies. An episode that references a specific political event from 2014 as a current event, when watched in 2024, reveals that time has passed in the real world while the characters remain fixed. The political event is now history. The cultural context has shifted. The joke that was specific and resonant in 2014 now points to a time that the show's characters who have not aged could not have experienced as 25-year-olds in the way the episode presented it. The floating time convention and the real-world engagement are in ongoing conflict, and the conflict is most visible in the episodes where the real-world engagement was most specific. This is not a criticism of the show's choice to engage with real events. That engagement has produced some of the show's most interesting and socially meaningful work. But it is worth noting as a source of a particular kind of inconsistency, the inconsistency that arises when a fictional world tries to simultaneously exist outside of time and within it. The show's relationship with technology is a specific and instructive example. In the earliest seasons, the technology available to the characters, the phones they use, the computers they interact with, the media they consume reflects the technology of 1999 and the early 2000s. This is simply the world of the show as it was when the show was made. As the show has continued, the technology has updated along with the real world. Characters now have smartphones. They use social media. They interact with streaming platforms and video calls and all the other contemporary technologies that were not part of the world in 1999. For a show where the characters do not age, this technological updating creates a specific kind of retroactive inconsistency. The characters who are now using smartphones are the same characters who were using flip phones and desktop computers in the early seasons, but they have not aged across the period during which the technology changed. They have simply acquired new technology without having experienced the passage of time during which that technology was developed and adopted. The show cannot acknowledge this without acknowledging the time that has passed, which would require acknowledging the ages the characters should now be. So the technology updates and the characters remain ageless, and the gap between these two facts is something the show quietly does not address. Expanded section: the question of the Griffins' neighbors and the geography of Spooner Street. The specific geography of Spooner Street, the immediate neighborhood in which the Griffin family lives and in which most of the show's local social life occurs, has its own set of inconsistencies that are distinct from the Dastas. Broader inconsistencies of Quahog as a whole. The Griffin house is at number 31. The Swanson house, where Joe and Bonnie live, is at number 33, placing it immediately adjacent to the Griffin house next-door neighbors in the most immediate sense. Quagmire lives on the same street, close enough to be in frequent contact with the Griffin family and to participate easily in the social life centered on the neighborhood. But the specific spatial relationships between these houses, which house is on which side of the Griffins, how far apart they are, what the view from the Griffin house's windows looks like in terms of the adjacent properties, have been depicted with enough variability across the show's seasons that the street's geography is not internally consistent. In some exterior shots, the Swanson house is clearly and immediately visible from the Griffin house, with the properties sharing a close spatial relationship that reflects their next-door neighbor status. In other shots, the relationship between the houses is depicted differently with more space between them, with different orientations, with the properties arranged in a configuration that does not quite match the most common depiction. Quagmire's house presents a similar variability. The specific side of the Griffins on which Quagmire lives has not been entirely consistent across all seasons. The distance between his house and the Griffin house has varied enough to raise questions about whether the show has always had the same picture of where on Spooner Street each house is located. These are, individually, minor inconsistencies of the kind that accumulate in any long-running show. Animated shows, in particular, frequently redraw their settings without strict reference to previous depictions, because the settings are drawn fresh for each episode rather than being fixed physical locations that can be re-photographed identically each time. The inconsistencies of Spooner Street's geography are the natural result of this reality of animation production, but they are worth noting because they are part of a larger pattern, the pattern of a show that has given its fictional world enough detail to feel real without giving it enough systematic consistency to actually be coherent. Spooner Street is real enough to feel like a place. It is not consistent enough to be a place you could navigate confidently if you could visit it. Its geography serves the story in each episode without maintaining a fixed relationship with itself across all the episodes that came before. The neighbors beyond the core group, the families who live on Spooner Street and in the immediate area beyond the major characters, have been depicted with even greater inconsistency. Background characters who appear as established neighborhood residents in certain seasons are absent in others. Houses visible in some exterior shots of the street do not appear in others. The population and density of the neighborhood fluctuates in ways that reflect the episodic needs of specific stories, rather than any consistent picture of what it would actually be like to live on this street. There is something evocative about all of this, actually, when you are in the right state of mind to experience it as evocative rather than frustrating. Spooner Street is not so much a place as it is a recurring feeling, the feeling of a familiar neighborhood, of houses you have walked past enough times that their exteriors are part of your internal landscape, of neighbors whose names you know even if you do not know them well. The specific details of the street change, in the way that the specific details of familiar places change in memory and in dreams. The general impression remains vivid while the particular facts blur and shift. You know Spooner Street the way you know a place from childhood, not photographically but emotionally, in a way that is real and unreliable at the same time. Expanded section. The character who was always there but nobody noticed. Continuity in the background. Family Guy is a show where the background is interesting in ways that the foreground sometimes obscures. Behind the main characters, across all the episodes and all the seasons, there are patterns in how the show's world is depicted that are worth noting for the specific light they throw on the show's relationship with its own continuity. Background characters, the people who populate the Drunken Clams tables, who sit in the bleachers of James Woods Regional High School events, who stand on the sidewalks of Spooner Street in exterior shots, have been drawn and redrawn across 25 seasons without any particular obligation to remain consistent from episode to episode. This is standard practice in animation, where background characters are often drawn as generic representatives of a category bar patron, high school student, passerby, rather than as specific individuals who would be expected to appear consistently across episodes. But Family Guy has also, across its run, created enough specific recurring background characters, people who appear in the background of multiple episodes with enough distinctive features to be recognizable, that the inconsistencies in how these background characters are depicted are visible to attentive viewers. A background character who appears in one season with a specific design appears in a different season with a slightly altered design, or does not appear at all without any story reason for the change. This is a very small category of inconsistency, and it matters less than the character biography inconsistencies or the geographical inconsistencies. But it is a symptom of the same underlying reality that produces all of the show's inconsistencies. The production of 25 seasons of television by a large and changing staff requires thousands of individual decisions about how to depict the show's world, and those decisions cannot all be made with reference to every previous decision that came before. The result is a world that is deeply familiar, that feels real in the way that only a world you have spent hundreds of hours with can feel real, and that is simultaneously riddled with contradictions at every scale. The big contradictions, the ones we have been working through together tonight, are the ones that generate the most discussion and the most entertainment. But beneath them are smaller contradictions, and beneath those even smaller ones, and the entire show is a fractal of inconsistency, the same pattern of flexible reality occurring at every level of scale, from the shape of the neighborhood down to the hair color of a background character in a bar that was never quite the same bar twice. And all of it, every contradiction, every impossibility, every reset and reversal and forgotten fact is held together by the fact that Family Guy is, at its heart, an act of imagination rather than an act of documentation. It is not trying to describe a real place or real people with consistent fidelity. It is trying to make you laugh, to make you feel, to give you something to spend time with that is recognizable and funny, and occasionally unexpectedly moving. The inconsistencies are the price of that project, the inevitable consequence of trying to do something for 25 years that was designed to be done week by week, story by story, joke by joke. The house on Spooner Street does not have a consistent floor plan. It has something better, a consistent feeling. The Griffin family does not have consistent ages or consistent histories. They have consistent natures, the specific qualities that make each of them recognizable and specific and real in the way that fictional people are sometimes more real than real ones. The town does not have a consistent geography. It has a consistent mood, the particular flavor of a working-class New England community as filtered through the sensibility of an animator who studied at the Rhode Island School of Design and built a world out of what he remembered and what he imagined. This is what survives the inconsistencies. This is what makes the show still worth visiting after 25 years. Still worth falling asleep to on a quiet night when the things that need to be done tomorrow can wait, and the mind wants something familiar and comfortable and slightly strange to drift through on its way to wherever sleep takes it. The house stands, the family is inside, the neighborhood is quiet, the lights are out. Sleep now. Sleep well. Thank you for being here. If this helped, a subscription helps back. Leave a comment with where you are in the world and what time it is. There is something I find genuinely wonderful about knowing that this is reaching people in different corners of the world at different hours of different days. See you in the next one. Expanded section. The Peter Griffin Economy of Behavior. Why he does what he does and why it keeps changing. There is a specific kind of comedy that works by placing a character who should know better in situations where they do not do better, and the comedy comes from the gap between what we expect the character to know and what they actually do. Peter Griffin was, in the early seasons, this kind of character, a man who was not sophisticated, who lacked the education and the intellectual resources to navigate situations with elegance, but who fundamentally understood the emotional logic of the world around him. He knew that Lois loved him. He knew that his children needed him. He knew that when he had done something wrong, the right thing was to acknowledge it and try to make it right. He could not always do these things gracefully. He often could not do them at all without several intermediate disasters. But the understanding was there, underneath the chaos. And it was what made the chaos sympathetic rather than simply ugly. The transformation of Peter's behavioral logic across the show's run has been discussed extensively in terms of character flanderization, the process by which a multidimensional character is progressively reduced to a smaller and smaller set of defining traits until the character is barely recognizable as a person. But there is a specific inconsistency in how this transformation has been applied that is worth examining in some detail, because it goes beyond simple character degradation and into something more structurally interesting. In the early seasons, Peter's failures are consistent with a particular kind of person. He makes bad decisions because he does not fully think through consequences. He hurts people because he is unable to anticipate how his actions will land. He says the wrong thing because he does not have the social processing to understand why it is wrong. These are the failures of a man with limited capacity operating at the edge of that capacity, genuinely trying, genuinely failing, and genuinely feeling bad about it when he realizes what has happened. In the later seasons, Peter's failures are consistent with a different kind of person entirely. Someone who causes harm without the self-awareness to recognize the harm as harm, or who causes harm knowingly because he is pursuing his own immediate interests without regard for anyone else. This is not the same character. It is not even the same kind of character. The gap between Peter, who is thoughtless because he lacks the capacity for careful thought, and Peter, who is thoughtless because he does not care enough to think, is an enormous gap, one that changes the entire moral texture of his character. The inconsistency this produces is that the show sometimes invokes the early version of Peter, the one who feels bad about what he has done, who tries to make things right, who has the emotional intelligence to understand that a relationship has been damaged and to attempt repair even in later seasons that have established the later version as the operating mode. An episode in season 15 might give Peter a genuine moment of remorse and genuine attempt at reconciliation with someone he has hurt. This moment lands with emotional force, because we remember the early Peter for whom such moments were characteristic, but it also sits in tension with the Peter of the seasons immediately surrounding it, who does not typically demonstrate this kind of self-awareness. The show wants to be able to draw from the warm version of Peter when the story calls for warmth. It wants the character to be capable of the emotional register that made him sympathetic in the early seasons. But it also wants to maintain the later version of Peter, the one whose behavior has become more extreme and more selfishly indifferent, because that version generates a different kind of comedy. The result is a character who oscillates between two incompatible versions of himself, with no explanation offered for the transitions between them, other than the requirements of each individual episode. This oscillation is visible in his relationship with his children across the full run of the show. Peter and Chris have, at various points, been depicted as having a reasonably warm father-son relationship, moments of genuine connection, shared interests, the kind of rough-and-tumble affection that characterizes certain father-son dynamics in working-class families. In other episodes, Peter treats Chris with the same casual dismissiveness that he applies to most people in his life, and the warm relationship is simply not operative in the scene. Peter and Stewie have their own inconsistent relationship. In the earliest seasons, Peter barely registers Stewie's existence as a specific personality. The baby is there. Peter interacts with him in the way that a limited father interacts with an infant, without any particular awareness of or engagement with Stewie's extraordinary inner life. In later seasons, particularly after Stewie's character has shifted away from the evil genius persona, Peter and Stewie have direct, specific interactions that require Peter to be engaging with Stewie as a person rather than simply as a baby in a room. The transition between these two modes of relating happens without any explicit acknowledgement that Peter's understanding of Stewie has changed, or that Stewie's relationship to his own ability to communicate has shifted. And then there is the relationship between Peter and Lois, which has its own 25-year evolution that is both the show's most central ongoing relationship and its most inconsistently drawn one. The foundational premise of their marriage, that Lois is the capable one who chose Peter knowing exactly what she was choosing, and that their love is real despite everything that works against it, is honored in some episodes and completely absent in others. Episodes that give the marriage genuine warmth and genuine feeling are present throughout the show's run, even in the later seasons. But they exist alongside episodes where the marriage is depicted as a kind of mutual captivity, where both participants seem to be enduring each other rather than loving each other, where the warmth that the foundational premise requires is simply not present. The show has never decided whether the Griffin marriage is a love story that happens to be very messy or a messy arrangement that is occasionally illuminated by real love. These two things produce different stories, and the show has told both kinds without committing to which one represents the truth of what Peter and Lois's marriage actually is. The answer changes based on which episode you are watching, which is to say, the answer changes based on which story that episode needs to tell. Expanded section: the logic of humor and why jokes contradict character. There is a specific kind of plot hole in Family Guy that is different from the biographical inconsistencies and the geographical contradictions we have been cataloging. It is the kind that arises when a joke requires a character to do something that the character's established personality or history would not support, when the needs of the humor override the internal logic of who the character is supposed to be. Every comedy makes this trade at one point or another. Humor requires characters to behave in ways that serve the joke, and the best comedy writers find ways to make the joke-serving behavior feel genuinely consistent with the character who is performing it. The worst comedy writing forces the character to perform the joke regardless of whether the character's established personality would produce this behavior, creating a kind of narrative dissonance, a moment where you are laughing at the joke but registering, somewhere in the back of your mind, that this is not quite right, that this person would not do this. Family Guy has been, particularly in its later seasons, a show where the joke's needs frequently override character consistency. This is partly a consequence of the show's reliance on cutaway gags, the format that takes the narrative out of the main story and into a brief, self-contained comedic sequence before returning. Cutaway gags have their own internal logic that does not necessarily need to be consistent with the character who sets them up. Peter says, "This is worse than the time I," and then the cutaway occurs, and the cutaway can depict Peter in a situation that is only loosely consistent with Peter as a character, because the cutaway is primarily a vehicle for the joke rather than a character-revealing moment. But the inconsistency created by joke-first writing is not limited to cutaways. In the main narrative of episodes, there are moments where characters do things that serve the joke at the cost of character consistency. A character who has been established as having a specific fear demonstrates no such fear when the absence of fear is funnier. A character whose relationship with another character has been established as warm demonstrates unexpected coldness when the coldness generates a better comedic reaction. A character whose intelligence has been established at a specific level suddenly demonstrates either more or less of that intelligence depending on what the scene requires. The show has, in some ways, acknowledged this. The fourth wall breaks where characters express surprise at their own behavior, the meta moments where the show winks at the audience about the gap between what the characters should be doing and what they are doing. But these acknowledgments are, as noted before, gestures rather than resolutions. They say, "I know this is inconsistent." They do not say, "Here is why the inconsistency is actually not an inconsistency." They leave the gap open even while pointing at it. What this produces, at scale, is a set of characters who are defined more by their recurring jokes than by their consistent psychology. Peter's stupidity is his recurring joke, and within any given scene, the level of that stupidity is calibrated to produce the best comedy from that specific scene, rather than to maintain a consistent level of cognitive limitation across all scenes. Brian's pretentiousness is his recurring joke, and it appears more prominently in scenes where the joke can be built out of it, and is less prominent in scenes where a different version of Brian is required. Stewie's precocity is his recurring joke, and it is calibrated up or down depending on whether the scene wants to play the intelligence or the vulnerability. This is a legitimate mode of character construction for comedy. Not every comedy operates with the tight psychological consistency of a prestige drama. The conventions of animated comedy have always allowed a certain flexibility in character definition. Characters are recognizable bundles of traits that can be emphasized or de-emphasized based on what the scene needs. Family Guy operates in this mode, and the mode has served the show well across its 25 years. But it creates specific inconsistencies that are visible when you zoom out far enough to see the character across many episodes rather than in any single one. The Peter who is hilariously, catastrophically stupid in season 19 is not quite the same Peter who was lovably, relatably stupid in season 2, and the difference is not simply a matter of how far the joke has been pushed. It is a matter of what the comedy has decided the character fundamentally is, and that decision has not remained constant. Expanded section. The consistency of inconsistency. What this all means. We have covered a great deal of territory together tonight. The house with its flexible rooms and its migrating basement entrance, Peter and his many pasts and his floating age, Brian and his impossible son and his incoherent origin story, Stewie and the rules that nobody could agree on about who could hear him, Quagmire at 61, or not quite 61, with real hair and also a wig, Meg and the father she may or may not have, Bonnie Swanson and the 7-year pregnancy, the town of Quahog and its contradictory geography, Lois and the accent that does not match her background, the economy of the Griffin family, which is sometimes precarious and sometimes mysteriously comfortable, the deaths that did not stick, the changes that were reversed, the facts that were forgotten. This is a lot of inconsistency for one show to contain. It is, frankly, an extraordinary amount. But here is what I find genuinely interesting about it, the thing that I want to leave you with as the night gets quieter and sleep gets closer. The inconsistency is not random. It follows a pattern, and the pattern tells you something real about how Family Guy was made and what it was trying to do. The pattern is this. Everything in Family Guy is subordinate to the story of the moment. Not the story of the season, not the story of the show, not the story of the character across 25 years of television, the story of this specific episode, this specific scene, this specific joke. The house has as many rooms as the current episode needs. Peter is as old as the current joke requires. Brian's origin is as clear or as murky as serves the current narrative. The characters know as much about each other as serves the situation, and they remember as much of their shared history as is useful for whatever is happening right now. This is, in essence, the operating philosophy of the cutaway gag extended to the entire show. A cutaway gag is a small story that exists completely in its own moment. It does not need to connect to what came before or what will come after. It just needs to be funny right now. Family Guy, in its most characteristic mode, applies this logic not just to cutaways but to everything, to plot, to character, to world building, to the laws of its own physics. Everything is the moment. The moment is everything. There is a price for this, and the price is the inconsistency we have been cataloging. When every scene is its own complete moment, the accumulated moments cannot always be assembled into a coherent whole. The house is whatever the current moment needs the house to be, which means the house across all the moments is not a single consistent thing. Peter is whoever this joke needs him to be, which means Peter across all the jokes is not a single consistent person. The world is as large or as small as the current story requires, which means the world across all the stories is impossible to map. But there is something honest in this too. Stories, real stories, the ones we tell each other about our lives and our families and the places we grew up, these are not consistent either. Memory is not consistent. The house you grew up in is larger in some memories and smaller in others. The person your parent was changes depending on which moment of your shared life you are recalling. The town you come from is different in the story you tell about it at 20 than in the story you tell at 40. Inconsistency is not only a feature of bad storytelling. It is a feature of all storytelling, including the truest kind. Family Guy is not making a claim to biographical accuracy or geographical consistency. It is making a claim to something else, to the experience of a specific world populated by specific people, with a specific kind of humor and a specific kind of feeling that has been maintained across 25 years of production with remarkable fidelity, even as all the specific facts around it have drifted and shifted and occasionally contradicted themselves. The feeling is the consistency. The house on Spooner Street feels like home because it always feels like home, regardless of how many rooms it has in any given episode. Peter feels like Peter because he is always recognizably himself in his appetites and his failings and his occasional moments of genuine warmth, regardless of whether his hair is the right color or his age makes mathematical sense. Brian feels like Brian in his most irritating later season form as much as in his most appealing early season form because the voice, the wit, the underlying vulnerability are always there, regardless of whether his biography is coherent. Stewie feels like Stewie whether he is building a doomsday device or crying about his friendship with Brian, because the accent and the intelligence and the absurd contrast between what he is and what he does are always operative. This is what has kept people coming back for 25 years. Not the consistency the show has demonstrated comprehensively. That consistency is not its strong suit. The feeling, the specific texture of spending time in this world. The green sofa and the orange cabinets and the red door and the neighborhood bar and the friends at the table and the family in the living room and the baby in the nursery with his plans that may or may not still be operational. All of it inconsistent. All of it completely recognizable. All of it, in its own strange way, home. Final expanded section 1. Last pass through the gaps. Details worth dwelling on before sleep. There are a few more threads worth pulling on before the night fully closes down, smaller inconsistencies and curiosities that did not fit cleanly into any of the larger sections, but that are interesting in their own right. The kind of details that settle into your mind and are pleasant to turn over in the half-light before sleep arrives. Consider the giant chicken. He is the most unusual recurring presence in the show's history, a giant, anthropomorphic chicken named Ernie who appears periodically throughout the series to engage Peter in elaborate and spectacular fights that destroy significant portions of the environments in which they take place. The fights are among the show's most visually ambitious sequences, and they have been celebrated by fans as one of the more genuinely creative, recurring elements of the later season's storytelling. The origin of the feud between Peter and Ernie is established in one of the early appearances. Peter received a spoiled coupon from Ernie, a coupon that turned out to have expired, and this small commercial disappointment escalated into a mutual enmity that has produced multiple devastating battles across many seasons. The logic of this origin is deliberately absurd. The joke is that this level of conflict should not arise from this level of slight, and the comedy of the chicken fight sequences depends on that gap between cause and effect. But the chicken's appearances across the show's run have not been entirely consistent in how they handle the relationship between Peter and Ernie. In some appearances, Ernie seems to have independent motivations for the confrontation, a genuine and persistent hostility toward Peter that goes beyond simple continuation of the original grudge. In others, the fight erupts from what seems like a chance encounter, as if neither party has thought about the other since their last meeting. In still others, the fight's conclusion seems to gesture toward a resolution, or at least an exhaustion of the conflict that subsequent appearances then contradict by renewing the confrontation. Ernie has also, in certain episodes, appeared not as an enemy but in a domestic context that suggests a life and a family separate from his conflict with Peter, a wife, apparently, and children, and the kind of ordinary existence that sits oddly alongside the spectacular violence of the fight sequences. These glimpses of Ernie's private life are interesting, precisely because they create a character behind the antagonist, a person for whom the fight with Peter is not the totality of his existence. But these glimpses have not been developed consistently across the show's run, and the domestic Ernie of certain episodes does not always connect seamlessly to the combative Ernie of others. The death character, the personification of death who appears in the early seasons as a significant episode presence, and who has since appeared with variable frequency, is another example of a character whose nature, capabilities have been established with enough inconsistency to generate genuine confusion. Death, in the episode where he is introduced, has specific rules. When he is not actively harvesting souls, people cannot die. This creates the episode's central premise. It establishes a clear and workable internal logic for how death functions in this world. But in subsequent appearances, these rules are not consistently applied. The nature of Death's authority, the specific mechanisms by which he operates, and the implications of his presence or absence for the mortality of the people around him have shifted enough across appearances that the original established logic has been effectively suspended. Death exists in the show's later seasons less as a character with consistent properties and more as a recurring visual joke, the skeletal figure with the scythe, showing up when the show wants to make a death-adjacent observation, without the specific rules that his first appearance established. The show's use of celebrity cameos and real-world figures, a recurring feature across all 25 seasons, creates its own category of inconsistency. Real people appear in Family Guy in ways that vary widely in how much they behave like themselves and how much they behave like characters in the show's fictional world. Some celebrity appearances are clearly meant to be understood as the actual person making a comedic appearance within the show's world. Others use a real person's name and likeness to tell a story that is clearly fictional and that the actual person almost certainly did not participate in as a reflection of their actual views or behaviors. The show has also, across its run, killed, humiliated, and otherwise harmed real public figures within its fictional world in ways that exist in a complicated, legal, and ethical space that the show has navigated by treating everything as clearly satirical. But the inconsistency in how the show handles real people, sometimes with what appears to be their genuine participation and sometimes with the complete fabrication of their behavior and speech, creates a kind of documentary ambiguity that has occasionally caused the show real-world difficulty, as when specific jokes about specific people or events generated controversy that extended beyond the fictional world in which the joke was made. The Meg as a character problem, which was addressed in its own section, has one additional dimension worth noting. Across the full run of the show, certain episodes have given Meg genuine competence, genuine strength, genuine capability that the rest of the series has not honored. She has been a competent athlete. She has shown specific skills, the saxophone, as introduced in the Simpsons crossover, and other abilities in isolated episodes that have not been carried forward into subsequent episodes where those skills would be relevant. She has, in certain episodes, demonstrated that she has genuine reserves of resilience and self-possession that the surrounding episodes suggest she does not have. The Meg who emerges from her best episodes is a considerably more interesting and capable character than the Meg who inhabits her worst episodes. This is not simply the show treating its characters variably according to story needs. It is specifically the show failing to consolidate the better version of a character whose default is defined by her own worst possible version. The capability the show demonstrates Meg can have has never been allowed to become Meg's default. The suffering has been allowed to remain Meg's default even as occasional episodes showed that a different default was possible. One final detail before the night fully closes. The show's internal mythology around Stewie's time machine and the specific rules it follows has generated, across its many uses, a set of temporal paradoxes that the show has never even attempted to reconcile. The time machine has been used to prevent events from occurring, and the events that were prevented are treated as having been erased from the timeline. It has also been used to visit historical moments, and the visits are treated as leaving the historical record intact despite the visitor's presence. It has created alternate timelines, and those timelines are sometimes treated as genuinely separate from the main timeline and sometimes treated as branches that fold back into the original. The specific rules of how time travel works in this fictional world are different in every episode that uses them, and the cumulative picture of the show's relationship with temporal logic is one of cheerful, total indifference to the task of being coherent about it. This is probably the most honest statement the show has ever made about its own relationship with logic. Not just temporal logic, all logic. The rules are whatever they need to be. The house is whatever size it needs to be. The characters are whatever age they need to be. The past is whatever the current story needs the past to have been. And the future is whatever comes next, which will be made out of the same flexible reality that has always constituted this world, assembled fresh from the available materials for whatever story comes along to need it. 25 years of that. 400 episodes of that. An enormous amount of television assembled on this principle. This willingness to let the story's needs determine the world's shape rather than the other way around. And what has it produced? Something beloved, something recognizable, something that people have been watching late at night, in the hours when the day is finished and the mind is loose and the distance between consciousness and sleep is narrow and pleasant for a quarter of a century. The house stands. The family is inside. The baby is in the nursery, surrounded by things that should not be there. The dog is on the green sofa, probably with a drink. The father is wherever the story needs him to be. Sleep now. Thank you for watching. Subscribe if this is the kind of content that helps you rest. Leave a comment, location, and time from wherever in the world you are. See you in the next one.